So, hello and welcome to this episode of Media Musings. I'm not sure if Empathy Respect is still in the audience, given how that chat was left. Like, well, let's see.
8 hours ago.
Yeah, eight.
Oh, well,
No,
hello.
more like
Hi.
10 hours ago.
Oh, well, Diesel, if you're watching, hi, mate.
Yeah. So, hello.
They're here. They are here.
Yep.
So do tell us the story and we'll
Yeah,
put it
so-
up because always good to interact.
And of course, hello to anyone who is lurking in the chat and or watching in the future. So, this was totally planned. This was not, some coincidence of fate of the stars aligning just perfectly that we happen to be covering Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter right after neo-Confederates start crying about making April, Confederate History / Heritage Month, and also the week before Renfield comes out in theaters. It's not a coincidence at all. I planned the whole thing. I'm a mastermind.
Well,
Yeah,
you're also like a week away from the anniversary of the Lincoln assassination as well. So
yeah, because it was Good Friday, wasn't
Yeah.
it? And I think Good
It was
Friday
like
was the middle of
April-
April that year.
yeah, it was like April 14th or 15th, I think.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. But yeah, so actually, Good Friday technically was this week for us. So, because the Catholic Church likes to fuck around with calendars and likes to pretend it's not on a lunar calendar like all those dirty pagans that came before it. I can say that I'm one of them. But yeah, so it's Easter weekend this weekend. And this is an interesting movie to do on Easter weekend.
Yeah.
Bringing people back from the dead and mythologized saviors of peoples, and fighting for the soul of a nation and a people's it's on point. Kudos, Ring. Kudos for the organization there.
Yeah.
I had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, and obviously I had everything to do with it, and it's not because we got fucked over on scheduling a couple weeks and had to push it back.
No, not at all. But yeah, so this movie, right? A couple of things we need to establish early on. This is not a historical movie.
Yeah.
This is not a movie that you should be citing in your essays about Abraham Lincoln. Unless your essay is about the reception of the mythology of the man. Yeah. In which case, go right ahead and stick around. We'll probably have some good tips for you.
Or unless you're unless you're a new atheist and you can find something in there that makes Christians look bad, because that's. I'm sorry.
I mean, there's plenty.
I'm not supposed to say that out loud, am I?
There's plenty in there that makes Christians look bad.
Yeah.
So yeah. This movie is very much. To understand this movie, you have to understand it came out in 2016.
2012.
So 2012. Yeah, 2012. So 2012. So Obama's in the White House. Which is very relevant.
Anyways, the story. Went to meet my girlfriend, had 15 minutes to kill, so I pulled into a random movie theater to see if the Abraham vampire movie was out. There were tons of people, and within 10 minutes of me arriving, all the cast and directors came out and gave a speech. They were doing a publicity tour in Korea, and I just happened to be there at the exact point in time.
Oh, nice.
Nice.
Very nice. Well done.
Yeah.
Now the reason I can say unequivocally that it was released in 2012 is because
besides the fact that that was when I was an undergrad.
It's because it was the second to last movie I saw in theaters before leaving AIT.
Yes. Yes, it will have been because you were in AIT. I was an undergrad. Yeah.
Yeah, the last movie I saw before leaving AI in theaters before graduating from AIT was Paranorman. This was the second to last, so it came out.
Yeah.
At least it hit the theater on base like October 2012.
Yeah, October, November 2012 sounds right, because I was in a American government and history class, US Government 101, and when the tutor found out that this was coming out, actually arranged a class outing to a local independent cinema to see it. So we all saw it together and then discussed it in class the following day.
Yeah.
Which was an interesting experience, which I'm sure you'll hear more about as this stream goes on.
Yeah.
And, you know, we teased out a lot of good things, which I think, you know, kudos to anyone I'm repeating from that class. If you ever happen to see this, it was like 10 years ago. I don't remember your name, but if your idea stuck with me, kudos to you. I'll try and say when it was something I said versus something someone else said, but the odds of me remembering are very slim. So this movie, I think, and it's really interesting, and I do want to talk about it, opens with we'll call it a meditation on the nature of history and historical study and historical reception.
Yeah.
And I'm sure one of you's probably got the lines or knows the lines.
I don't. Ring would probably be best to remember in the lines at the beginning of the movie, but
yeah.
Well, it bookends the movie.
Yeah, I was quite impressed. Because I was quite impressed with the sort of final lines in that.
Yes, it does bookend the movie. And I'm just looking. I'm trying to find it on IMDb if I can get the line, because it's a very interesting meditation on the nature of history and how we remember.
Yeah.
And on the nature of just how America mythologizes its presidents as well, and its national heroes. And I'm not saying America's the only country that's doing it. I'm just saying this is a very specifically American movie.
Yeah. Because listen, because we came across it. If we you know, just for this record, we'll say it just in case anyone watched last week. We weren't Yank bashing last week. We're not intending on Yank bashing this week. It's
like we were not like last week. I can't remember what film we did.
Superman versus
Superman
the Elite.
Superman.
Yeah.
So no, we're not Yank bashing. What we're looking at is look. Sometimes Yanks bash themselves, and that's what happened last week. Okay.
Yeah. And just before we go any further on the how America mythologizes its presidents, I'll just say two words. As we're British, myself and 2 words: Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So, but hey, at least the myth of Lincoln. You know, at least the person America mythologized actually was anti-slavery rather than pro-concentration camp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have opinions about Churchill. Don't get me started.
It'll come. I'm sure if we do a war movie at some point, it's going to come up, Noodle. So we'll put a pin in that for another time.
So I've got the line here. History prefers legends to men. It prefers nobility to brutality, soaring speeches to quiet deeds. History remembers the battle but forgets the blood. Whatever history remembers of me, it remembers me. If it remembers me at all, it shall only remember a fraction of the truth. For whatever else I am, a husband, a lawyer, a president, I shall always think of myself first and foremost as a hunter of darkness.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting meditation on the nature of history and legacy.
Yeah.
And I think it is worth teasing that out. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy and paste the words, and Ring, can you put them up as like a banner so we can just have them in front of us?
Yeah.
Because I think this movie is a popcorn movie. Yeah. This movie is not asking you to employ higher order thinking here. But we are, because we're media musings, and if that was all we had to say, we could
That's-
cut it now at 11 minutes and be done.
Yeah.
That's kind of what we do. That's kind of what we do in these streams. Okay.
Yeah, like, so that's what we do. Now, it does. Now, this is an excellent criticism of what we call empirical historiography.
Oh, it's slightly too long to be a banner.
That's fine. That'll do. Whatever history remembers of me. It's a very interesting criticism because it's a valid criticism of empiricism. Now, empiricism as a historical approach, and this is going to sound so simple, you're going to think you don't get it. You do get it. It is that stupid. Empiricism says if we didn't witness it and if there isn't literal textual evidence of it, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
If it wasn't written down, it didn't happen. Or if there isn't record of it, it didn't happen. And by record, I don't mean material evidence like archaeology. I mean books or filming in later years.
Yeah.
Like, it only happened if we witnessed it. And it really is that stupid. But that is the origin of historiography. That's where most history started. History started as someone witnessed it, therefore it happened, therefore we write it down.
Mm-hmm.
That is an incredibly, incredibly immature way of viewing history. It's the first lecture in most history courses on that, at which the following 6 or 7 lectures usually thoroughly debunk it and show why it's no longer a valid approach. Because it says here, it prefers nobility to brutality. That's one of the main criticisms of empiricism. Empiricism assumes that if you think, for example, if you think that the only history that happened is what's written down, that means that for the majority of human history, the majority of human lives didn't happen, are not relevant, don't matter, and cannot teach us anything. Because the majority of humans throughout history were not writing shit down. They were not. So what you get if you focus only on what's written down is a very European, upper class, like white or, Northern European history.
So basically, according to empiricism, the first historically significant event was this bastard Aya Nasir sold me some crappy copper.
Pretty much. Yeah. Or the first valid historical event was the Trojan War. Like, that's what we're talking about here. Now, it's the big man view of history, because if you're only reading about big historical figures and they're the only people who matter, like, we all know about Henry VIII, but do we know how the average peasant under Henry VIII lived? Empiricism says that doesn't matter. Never mind the fact that the peasants rose up against Cromwell later and suddenly became very important, but it doesn't matter where they came from because it wasn't written down. That's what empiricism says. In a nutshell, that's a very broad thing. Please don't anyone come for me if you are an empirical historian. And not actually do. I will wipe the floor with you.
This is why because I have a tendency towards that, but I'm not a historian. This is why I don't take noodle. I know better than to take noodle on this stuff.
The thing is, when there are historians who do it, professional historians, people who are graduates in history do it, they annoy me, and I will absolutely insult them and go toe to toe with them. The problem is with empiricism, right? It's also how the average person who's not trained in history will look at history. You're told a story of history. You're not given citations. You're not taught where that information comes from. You're taught a narrative. And you're taught a narrative right up until higher education in most in most cultures.
Yeah.
You're not taught, we're not taught, we're taught, for example, in the UK, GCSE, you do a module on the Nazis, because of course you do. And we're taught that, Churchill was a hero and Britain stood up against the might of the Nazis, but no one says where this information comes from. You're just taught to regurgitate it and to believe it, and then to wave your flag, when the Queen goes past or the King goes past.
Or can I say the one that was very prominent when I was at school? The British Empire was a wonderful altruistic thing that helped bring civilization to the world.
Yeah, and the only reason you can have that opinion of the British Empire is if the only sources for your history are writings by people who were like in the upper echelons of the British Empire.
We were manifesting our destiny to make America span across the continent.
Yes. And then you've got this next thing he says, soaring speeches to quiet deeds. Again, this is a criticism of empiricism and the big man view of history.
Yeah.
Empiricism lends itself to the big man view of history. It lends itself to histories of one man, one lifetime, one event, one battle, one this, one that.
Yeah.
It doesn't lend itself to understanding the history of the, very pointedly in this movie, the Underground Railway in America, the railroad in America. It doesn't lend itself to understanding the Haitian Revolution from the point of view of the revolutionaries. It doesn't lend itself to understanding why the working poor in the Industrial Revolution in Britain would rather go live on the streets than go live in a workhouse.
Yeah.
Because that shit wasn't written down. And therefore you have to go beyond empiricism to understand life itself. But if you just want to hear about how King Henry had 6 wives and argued with the Pope, by all means enjoy your empirical history. Yeah. But don't go looking at any portraits of him or listening to any of the music he wrote or anything like that, because that's not empiricism. That's not empiricism, because that's art history and other stuff. Empiricism is what was written down about him or what he wrote down. And this is the thing where it says history remembers the battle but forgets the blood. Empiricism, again, and they are using empiricism as the beaten post it sort of to beat history with, which is, I think, unfair. But what empiricism says, this battle happened on these dates, this many people died, this many people were injured, this many people were on the battlefield, this is how many guns there were, this is how many shots were fired. It's a Wikipedia stuff of an article. It's what empiricism says. Empiricism says that the general ordered them to go left and then go right, or go up the hill or down the hill. Whereas when you get into other histories, when you start talking about the letters soldiers wrote home, when you start talking about the songs sung and the marching tunes and the other stuff, you get a greater sense of the battle, but you get a sense of the human beings in the middle of it. Into the Valley they rode is not empirical history.
Yeah.
But it's what we all know. We all know that one.
Yeah.
And that was an order. That was a botched order. Yeah. But we wouldn't know that if we only looked at empirical history and the military records.
Yeah.
Like, you show me a person's military record. Show me what awards they got, what medals they got, what rank they were, what field arena of battle they fought in. Doesn't tell me shit about the person. Doesn't tell me about their girlfriend at home or their mother, or what their favorite food was, what their favorite TV show was, what their favorite song was, and that's what makes them human.
Well, also the sentence also is a meditation on specifically history remembers the battle but forgets the blood.
Oh, I'm getting there, but go on.
On it, how we like to have a grand, heroic view of war, rather than view war how it really is, which is horrific.
Yeah, don't trade the decorum est and all that.
Yeah, to quote the great philosopher Hawkeye Pierce, war is war and hell is hell, but of the two, war is worse.
War is worse.
Yeah.
War is the significant worst of the two. Yeah. And this is the thing, right? We look back on battles in history, and historians of all flavors, not just empiricists, do it. There is this tendency to view it as a monolith, to view all soldiers as a monolith. And this is particularly relevant to the American Civil War, which, again, is relevant to this movie.
Definitely.
Because everyone will sit there and argue that, Southern soldiers were fighting for slavery, but no, they weren't. In much the same way, Northern soldiers were not fighting against slavery. That's not what the average Joe on the ground was fighting for. Yeah. He was fighting for his farm and his family because he didn't want some fucking foreigner taking over his farm and destroying his livelihood.
And I'm going to say this, that one of the I think good things about it's nothing like I said. One of the good things if the American Civil War for something to study is we do have an awful lot of like letters from soldiers and stuff at the time, and diaries, and some of them are really fascinating reads.
Yeah, it's like as with other things. To give another example from history that's nothing to do with the American Civil War, when the Titanic went down, everyone's got this mental image of what that was like and how the people must have felt and everything else. But there's stories of like people in first class in the lifeboats. There's stories of people who. There was one woman, she wrote a letter 2 days after they went down when they got picked up by the Carpathia, and she wrote to her sister. And the way she wrote, you can read the letter. It's really callous. It's really callous, and she's talking about and she's more worried about the beautiful chandelier from one of the dining rooms than she's the human beings.
Yeah.
And it comes across really callous. And then you realise she lost everything when that ship went down. Her husband was on that ship. Her dog was on that ship. She lost everything. She literally has the clothes she stood up in and the kindness of the strangers on the boat that picked her up. And you realise she's probably in shock.
Yeah.
She's probably in shock. She's probably not that callous. But then you get other stories like the White Star Line tried to charge the families of the musicians for the suits they died in.
I'm going to have to say, I just want to say, this is a tiny little tangent, but on the Titanic, people might know where I come from, okay? Southampton, which is where the Titanic sailed from. And a lot of people who went down on the Titanic, who worked on it, people from Southampton. That was one of those things, the Titanic, that for decades it was like, we don't talk about the Titanic.
British stiff upper lip and all that.
Yeah, but it was like one of those things. We don't talk about it. It was still just because there was obviously people who even going on decades later who'd lost family and still remember it, and it was one of those things that we don't talk about it. Then of course James Cameron's movie came out, and we had like local politicians who were like, "Oh, we got a connection with this. Let's try and find a way of cashing in on this as much as we possibly can now. Now enough time's passed by." So yeah. Sorry, that was a little tangent, but
no, but you're exactly right, and this is the thing, right? And again, just to carry on that tangent just a little bit before I bring us back. If we based our knowledge of what happened the night the Titanic went down, or what happened on the Titanic on just empiricism. Empiricism says that there are menus left over, so we know what was served for dinner. Empiricism says that newspaper clippings tell us what happened. Empiricism doesn't say that we found people who couldn't make it to the lifeboats hugging and as the water surrounded them in their beds in their cabin. Empiricism doesn't say that because that wasn't written down. Empiricism just says there were two skeletons in the cabin. That's all that says. And that's the difference. Like, empiricism is very You know, when you get people who claim that history has to be objective, or claim that they are being objectively historical because they are attempting to strip all emotion and feeling and humanity from a historical event.
Yeah.
That's empiricism.
Which is,
I think,
wrong. Like, in my opinion, there's only one unifying truth of history.
There is no truth.
No, the one unifying truth of history is humans are going to human.
Yeah. Well, I think I've seen this with, and as I said, listen, I'm not a historian. I have an interest in history, but I'm not a historian.
Honestly,
I know
you don't do too badly.
I know my but I know I'm aware of my limitations, and I know that I have a tendency, like with stuff like this, I have a little tendency to get hit up on like little details, like, oh, this didn't happen, that didn't happen. Where so Noodle can look at this and say, yeah, but maybe, but is that really the point?
Yeah, it's not about what happened. It's about what it's saying. Yeah,
what it's saying. And you know, but I often see this because, especially when I get into the, should we just say, I'm not going to mention any names, but should we say certain big atheist influencers who may think they may have a very, very good grasp of like something like science, but don't seem to realize history doesn't work the same way as an academic discipline.
Look, history is right. Everyone thinks history is a soft subject. Let me explain to you the difference between history. When you get to advanced levels of history, you'll never see a multiple choice exam. You'll never see an exam with an objectively correct answer.
Yeah.
You'll never be asked. History doesn't, like, I went through 3 years of undergraduate history. I studied for the master's, but didn't do the thesis on classical studies. And in all that time, I don't think I ever had anyone say to me, you have to know these dates, or you have to know what happened here. That's not what history is about. History is about, when you get to the advanced level, it's about understanding humans and the process by which humans act and how that has an impact. So when I talk about, I know about the Battle of Gettysburg. I know that, Lincoln stood up and made a speech at the end. Yeah. And, that speech is what laid the foundations for the abolition of slavery in America.
So,
but let me finish. But that speech did not come out of thin air. I don't know what date that speech was made on. I only know it was at Gettysburg because the clue's in the fucking name.
Yeah.
What I do know is that speech came off the back of several decades of abolitionist movement, off the back of the Underground Railroad, off the back of all what led up to it, and then I also understand its consequences later. And I understand its consequences within the myth of Lincoln. I don't give a shit when it happened or the exact date. No one cares. What people care about is, do you understand why this matters? And that's what history is at the advanced level. And again, it sits diametrically opposed to this empirical approach of it happened on such and such a day at such and such a time with such and such people there.
Yeah.
No one cares. No one cares. Don't tell me what you know. Tell me what you understand. And that's the difference. I can say that the speech at Gettysburg tells me that Lincoln was an ardent abolitionist. I can say that the reception of the speech at Gettysburg was unprecedented, and what that meant. I don't give a shit what date it was said on, or whether it was said in the morning or the afternoon. Like, why would I? Like, it's. And again, that happens with a lot of things. Like, I still sometimes have to Google the dates for the Second World War. Like, sometimes I just don't remember what dates the Second World War happened. Like, I want to say 39 to 45. Like, but I can reel off reams and reams of history about the Second World War and the Holocaust and all of it. because the dates are not what matters. The details of the time and and what was going on very rarely matter to the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Like, it's very rare that the details of what brand of gun someone used matters. Like, we all know Kennedy got shot. Does anyone know the brand of the gun that shot him? I don't think so. Well, you do.
Sorry, it had to be. I had to get one in. I had to get one in.
Yeah, but of course you do, Scummer. But that's the point I'm making. It doesn't matter, because what mattered most on that day was Kennedy was shot. What happened next? How did the way his secret services behaved, and the way Jackie behaved, and the way Bobby even behaved, how did that have an impact on the American people and the politics of America at the time? And how does that continue to have an impact on American politics?
Yeah.
And that's what matters more than what brand the gun was, or whether the bullet went in through the back of his head or through his throat, or whatever the fuck the conspiracy theories are saying. You know, or whether it came from a grassy knoll or a factory window. It doesn't matter.
I'm going to say I endorsed the Red Dwarf version of the Kennedy assassination conspiracy that JFK was the second gunman on the grassy knoll when he killed himself.
I mean, given what was happening to him politically at the time, that's not as mad as you'd think.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's why I really wanted to dig into this little voiceover speech thing, because it's so important, because it sets this movie up to say to you, look, this isn't about the details and the events. Like, the clue was in the name, Vampire Hunter. No one's asking you to look for historical accuracy here. What this film's asking you to do is look at symbology and consequences and causes and effects, which honestly is pretty deep for an action flick that you should be sitting down to watch with popcorn.
Yeah.
But it's a really interesting way of opening the film, because it primes you to do real history and not just empirical history. It primes you to not give a shit if there's, you know, if one of the ladies' dresses has a zip on the back.
Yeah.
Or, you know, if someone's dress was machine sewn, or if that gun didn't actually get made until 50 years after, or, you know, they weren't doing that military formation until the 1912s or whatever.
Yeah.
This is the kind of, see, this is where this, having been like a American Civil War reenactor in my past, this is the pointing out, getting head up on that sort of stuff is a bad habit. I think I picked up from that.
Yeah.
As a reenactor, you are perfectly within your rights to say that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong.
Yeah.
But
but
it's
also a bad habit that I realise.
I challenge you with this question, Scummer. As a reenactor, what has been a reenactor? What has that contributed to your understanding of American politics, the lives of African Americans in America, and American culture?
I'd say it's mixed. I wouldn't say it's contributed nothing, but I think there's definitely been things that have contributed a lot more since I gave up like reenacting, and because I think, you know, you do. This was just the thing I remember that we would get very het up on certain details when we watch, you know, Civil War films and so on. You know, like, oh, okay, that, you know, they're, you know, this formation's a bit wrong, or, you know, we get a little head up on that we have those tendency to get het up on them. And like sometimes like certain, like, now I've got a good example. I'm gonna just say this, like, it wasn't until many years later, see, when the movie Gods and Generals came out, and I watched it, and I was quite impressed with like all the way it was done, and the film that. And it wasn't until many years later that I suddenly understood the amount of lost cause pro-Confederate propaganda there was in that fucking film. I couldn't see it at the time. I see it now.
Because you were focused on, are they using the right guns, are the uniforms right?
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of empirical history does. It blinds you to the bigger picture. You get so hung up on the details of this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, that you don't stop and think, okay, but why? What caused it? What does it mean? And what did it lead to?
Yeah.
Like people talk about, oh, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes.
Yeah.
But you cannot understand that history rhymes if all you're looking at is events in isolation and the bare bones of information.
And
imagine if you tried, for example, imagine if you tried to put together the story of Brexit with only newspaper headlines and government speeches.
It's going to sound, let's put it this way. If future historians base Brexit on headlines and speeches from certain politicians now, prominent politicians nowadays, it'll make it sound like Brexit is like the best thing that ever fucking happened.
Yeah.
And not look at some of the, we're not getting into a Brexit debate, but there's also, the point is, we can also look at this. Okay, there was consequences that not all of them have been positive. That's whatever side of the Brexit argument you fall
but if
on.
you base it purely on the headlines and the government documents, you're not going to see that. You're not going to see about people marching in the streets and, the rise of hate crime and the rise of, right-wing politics and the rise of anti-European sentiment. You're not going to see all of that because that's not in the government documents. But it happened, and it was just as an important part of that event as anything else. But if you only base it on government documents and writings, you're never going to know the whole story. Yeah. And this is, a lot of historical schools of thought were born as reactions to empirical history. So things like oral history and counter history. So what they do is, like, a lot of history that we have about ethnic minorities, about American slaves, is not... Look, if we only knew about American slaves, that which was written down, we'd have what? A few government speeches, adverts in newspapers for runaway slaves, and like maybe one or two novels of freed slaves as part of the abolition movement, if we were lucky.
You'd have Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, and nothing else.
That's exactly what you'd have.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you'd have, and that's the myth that this initial speech is actually, I think, criticizing. And the point is being made of, there's a reason in this movie that at every step Abe takes towards emancipation, his black best friend is stood right there telling him what to do and reminding you that he only cares about this shit because he's personally invested in someone.
Yeah.
Like, it's there to remind you that there's no such thing as a great man in history. It's there to remind you we all have biases and we're all human. Because this, despite the fact that it's very much the myth of Lincoln and it's very much, creating a mythology around the man, this movie very much does go out of its way to show, actually, Lincoln was a human being with human faults and who made human mistakes.
Yeah.
And that's not to say it's not a pro-Lincoln propaganda piece. It absolutely is. But in that sense, for that particular point it's making within the broader propaganda, it's surprisingly balanced.
It's almost like a tiny little bit of subversion, I think, in a propaganda piece that I think only a few people like Noodle and so are gonna pick up on.
Look, this is the thing with propaganda as well. Good propaganda, and by good I mean competent, not good as in morally good or ethically good. Because I don't believe it can ever be morally or ethically good to produce propaganda. Good propaganda, competent propaganda, will always subvert itself slightly. Because most people are reasonably, like, even the ones that are not well educated, have a reasonable sense of this is right, this is wrong.
Yeah.
And propaganda tries to tap into that. And the way propaganda does that is it flatters. It makes the person receiving it feel clever.
Yeah.
And if you make someone feel clever, you can get away with a lot before they'll notice what you're doing.
Yeah.
Like, if you flatter your audience and say you're too clever to fall for the propaganda, they will absolutely eat up the propaganda you serve them on a silver
That's
platter.
all. That's yeah. I mean, sir.
Now, as we're getting into the movie itself, at transitioning from approach to history and into the movie itself, it's probably best that we address the author and the screenplay writer, Seth Grahame-Smith, because it's kind of his oeuvre to basically take other works of literature, because for Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, he took the Diary of Abraham Lincoln and add horror elements to tease out metaphors, either in the period itself or in the text, to make it plainer to casual readers.
Okay. The thing about horror is not just horror.
Yeah.
Horror is, as a genre itself, a criticism of usually the culture it's released into.
Yeah.
It's like, it is not an accident that a movie about Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter came out like at the tail end of Obama's presidency. Well, first term.
Yeah.
It is not an accident that at a time when America was very much grappling with what it was as a nation, was very much grappling with the fact that a good percentage of the population was still not comfortable and still not willing to accept a black man as president. And that because that election against Mitt Romney was in no way guaranteed. Like, the whole world was watching and holding its breath that night. I know, because I went to a pub lock-in and I remember every second of it.
Yeah.
Well, most of it. I think I got a bit drunk by the end. But America, like, that was the election for the soul of America. That was how we understood it from the outside looking in. And so when these movies start coming out, superhero movies were big in that era. This movie came out, and other movies like it, is because the war America is fighting in real life always gets fought in Hollywood as well. Because that's what Hollywood is for. And Hollywood decided that they were fighting, as this movie puts it, for the soul of a nation.
Yeah.
And this movie was like, and again, it's propaganda, but it's pro-Lincoln propaganda. It's pro-Obama propaganda.
Yeah.
And it's not subtle about it. And that's why it's so important to understand the context of the movie. Because the movie says way more about 2012 than it does about Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine if that movie got released now? There'd be people screaming that it was woke, that it was, somehow anti-white racist, that it was, there was a culture war against the... Like, just imagine, just 10 years afterwards, if that movie got released now, that holy hell, that would kick off on Twitter over it.
Well, I mean... Well, remember, there's a reason, like, spoilers for my shilling at the end, but there's a reason I decided to say, fuck it, I'm going to monkey paw the Neo-Confederates and turn the rest of April into Confederate Media Month.
Yeah. Oh, in our case, anti-Confederate Media Month.
Yeah.
And it is very, and again, And we see it now. Like, you look at films that are coming out now, they are a reaction to what's going on in American life, American politics, American culture.
Yeah.
And they tell us, like, if we get movies like Till came out last year.
Yeah.
That tells us a lot more about 2022 than it does about the year Till got murdered.
Yeah.
Like,
well, and because
Yeah.
like culture and media is basically an Ouroboros, where the culture influences the media and the media influences the culture in a vicious cycle.
say that word again.
Ouroboros.
I think that you mean the snake eating its tail,
Yeah.
don't you? Right, that's not how I pronounce that word. But okay, yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
fine. I just assume it's an American difference. It's
Yeah.
not how I've not to pronounce
Accent.
that word. I've always pronounced that Uberus, but okay. I don't know which of us is right or if it matters. I sincerely doubt that it matters.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a really interesting. Like, this is the whole thing. Like, you hear me say this so often on Media Musings. The film is always representative more of the context it's released into than what it's talking about, especially when it's a historical narrative it's telling.
Yeah.
Like, there's like, why did we care in 2000 about the Titanic?
Yeah.
Why did we, like, in 1997, why did we give a shit about the Titanic? Like, in the 2010s, why did we give a shit about the Marvel Cinematic Universe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could it possibly have had something to do with the global war on terror and post 9/11 politics?
Well, I think good example is the historical epic Kingdom of Heaven. Now, not a great movie, in my opinion, but you look at that and you're seeing that it is trying to tap into like questions we're trying to ask ourselves as a society about like the relationship with like the Muslim world as a Western society. You could make a film about the Crusades and
Now,
yeah, exactly. And the Crusades become analogous for the war on terror. It's like, do you think Druck, Another Round, would have got the best foreign language film if we hadn't spent 18 months in lockdown gagging to go out for a
beer? Yeah.
Yeah. And Scummer, I think you and I may disagree on Kingdom of Heaven, but to be fair, I think
it's a good movie.
I remember it as a good movie, but if I remember right, the last time I saw it, I was still very fundy, so I may have to revisit it.
To be fair, it's been a long time since I've watched it as well. So,
yeah.
Do you think in the Thatcher and post-Thatcher years, the number of Robin Hood things that came out was an accident?
Yeah.
Like, no. But again, this is the point I'm making. It's all about the context. And when you think about 2016, it is perfectly, like, having lived through it, we understand without having to be told, yes, that was a movie that came out at the exact right time.
Yeah.
But what we also have to grasp, and what a lot of people don't when they look at things like that, it's like, why did The Godfather come out in the 60s? It's like, why did the A-Team come out when it did? Why did Star Trek come out when it did?
Yeah.
Why did Star Wars come out when it did? This is not an accident. Hollywood and the media in general, especially when you're talking about organized media like movies and TV shows, they are first and foremost propaganda machines. They are there to make a profit. And the way you make a profit with a media audience is by telling them what they want to hear. That, by definition, is propaganda.
Yeah.
Therefore, in order to turn a profit and be a powerful media house, you have to produce propaganda, whether you like it or not. That's how you make money.
Yeah.
And you've got, why did Godzilla come out when it did?
Yeah.
Do you think it's an accident that the creator of Godzilla survived a nuclear bomb?
Yeah.
Like,
well, or
Like,
or like in America, radiation makes superheroes. In Japan, it makes unstoppable monsters.
exactly.
Or why do you think that? Why do you think the remake came out in the 1990s when French nuclear testing in the South Pacific suddenly became a big issue again?
Yeah. Why did we start making Vietnam War films again in the early 2000s?
Yeah.
Could it have been because America had knocked on the door of Iraq and Afghanistan? Maybe. Like, you'd be hard pressed to find an argument against it. There were books. I was an undergrad in 2012, and by 2012 there were already books on the history section of the university library with titles like Iraq and Vietnam Parallel Wars.
Yeah.
And Iraq was still ongoing at that point. Like, so it wasn't subtle. And one of the chapters in that book, although that wasn't the exact title, I don't think, one of the chapters in that book was about the media portrayal of these two wars. We all saw the men who stare at goats. We saw it on the news every day. That's what that was like. Like, why they released American Sniper?
Yeah.
Do you know American Sniper has a Vietnam equivalent in 99 confirmed kills?
Yeah.
It's propaganda.
I mean, one of the classic ones I always bring up with this is the movie First Blood, which is the beginning of the Rambo franchise. Which, if anyone is now, again, I'm not going to spend too long on this because I actually think First Blood could be its own episode of Media Musings at some point. But by the time it was adapted for film, it totally strayed away from what the original novel was, and where the original novel was written when Vietnam was still going on, and and it was a transposal of the war into America, and the difference between the gaps in generation and polarization that was going on. By the time that it was released as a movie, it was like we were suddenly in Reagan's America. And I think, for Rambo films sort of reflected that. And it got very,
Rambo, let me tell you what the Rambo films reflect. The Rambo films reflect that the first war film about Vietnam was the Green Berets, in which John Wayne went to the president for permission to produce his propaganda movie.
Yeah.
He's Western in Vietnam because he wanted to be a cowboy with a more powerful gun. Like,
yeah.
And American cinematography built on that foundation of films about the war and propaganda. But again, we've spent nearly an hour on this one topic. And we've not even gotten into the movie proper. Now, there's a few bits I just want to get out the way. Lincoln's mother did die when he was a child. He was 9 years old when she died. So that's historically accurate.
Yeah,
I don't know if Lincoln had a black friend in real life or not. I don't.
Probably not. Would be my guess.
Probably not. I would suspect.
I mean, look, definitely through a modern lens. If you read some of the things Lincoln would say, you'd say if anything, by our standards, Lincoln is a bit of a racist. But to be honest, his views may have been seen a bit more progressive at the time.
So I'm just quickly looking. William Henry Johnson was a free African American and personal valet of Abraham Lincoln. He first worked for Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois, and accompanied him to his first inauguration. So he was his valet barber and later messenger for the Treasury.
Yeah.
And he was paid at about $600 a year, about $18,000 in 2021 money. So he was the childhood friendship is not there, but they have drawn from a real human being.
Yeah, and it's possible that they had a friendship. We don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to point out a man's valet. Okay, like from a historical point of view, when a man had a valet, Your valet is a man who dresses you, serves your food. So you trust this man not to poison you. You trust him to hold a straight razor to your neck every day. You trust him to see you naked. You trust him to carry your most private messages. So absolutely, like, this man is closer to you than your brother by a, like, there has to be some loyalty there, because would you trust a random employee to shave you?
Can I just say, in my head canon, this is just my personal head canon, William Henry Johnson was Jeeves to Abraham Lincoln's Worcester.
Very much so.
This is my head. I want to believe that William Henry Johnson was technically the valet, but the one who's really in charge, kind of like.
Quite possibly.
That's my personal head canon. What I choose to believe. Okay.
Well, the thing is with like, I'm quickly reading about William Henry Johnson now. Lincoln guaranteed the mortgage on Johnson's house.
Yeah.
So clearly there was something resembling a friendship there, and a mutual trust, and I hesitate to say love, because there are also
because there's examples you can look at from this.
There are some examples. Look, I'm going to acknowledge it now, and then we're going to move past it. There are some historical examples from Lincoln's writings that he may not have been entirely straight.
Mm-hmm. Possibly,
that he had, if not male lovers, then incredibly deep platonic relationships with men.
But
also,
and his wife was fully aware and consenting to this, so far as we can tell.
But also, as well, you can also look at certain things on the other side of the divide. It's very possible that in slave states there were, it's possible that there were actual friendships between, people who were enslaved and their masters. It's not to say that it didn't happen, but that's a little bit short of and again, shout out to our 10 shy. It's a little bit short of woohoo, Black Confederates, bang, bang, bang.
No, but we're talking about a man here. When we talk about William Johnson, we're talking about a man Lincoln paid for his funeral and burial. And best we can guess is he's buried at Arlington.
Yeah.
Like, Lincoln had him buried at Arlington as William H. Johnson, citizen.
Yeah.
This is a black man whose mother was a slave, buried at Arlington with a headstone that reads that.
What a slap in the face that was to Robert E. Lee as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
To have him buried there, because little bit of historical information.
And
Arlington was chosen. Yeah.
I'm just looking here. There's an anecdote, and it is only an anecdote, and it's not substantiated, but the story goes Lincoln himself ordered that Johnson's headstone be inscribed with the epitaph "Citizen." And it was chosen as a one-word inscription as direct refutation to the Dred Scott decision. So we're talking about two men who are as close as brothers, who absolutely trust each other with their lives. And it's very obvious when you look at Lincoln's political history. Like, Lincoln got political in Springfield. Something happened in Springfield to make Lincoln wake the fuck up, basically. And knowing that about William Henry Johnson, it's entirely possible him and Johnson becoming friends, and Johnson being his valet is what triggered that.
Yeah. And on Lincoln's mother dying, both Lincoln's mother and William Todd Lincoln, his son, died of something called milk sickness, which Seth Graham Smith then used to say, infection from a vampire bite.
Yes. And the son actually contracted a mild form of smallpox.
Yeah.
And actually, according to this, Johnson cared for Lincoln when Lincoln caught varioloid, which is a mild form of smallpox, and it killed Johnson. Johnson paid the link. This is really interesting. Lincoln paid off the mortgage on Johnson's family house and sent the money to his family. He paid off half a loan that he had co-signed, and the banker insisted on cancelling the other half of the debt. So William Henry Johnson is not only Lincoln's valet, he's a man who a banker also respects. So this is very much what I'm getting at here is this relationship between the two of them. Yes, the movie makes them vampire hunters and gives them that childhood history, but it didn't necessarily need to. Like, it does it for our modern sensibilities because it suits us to believe that Abraham Lincoln was born, died in the wool abolitionist from the age he could walk. Like, it suits us to believe that this 8-year-old child would go after someone whipping a black boy with an axe. It suits us to believe that of Abraham Lincoln because it feeds into the mythology of this perfect, stalwart, virtuous, the great emancipator. It feeds into that, but it's not necessary from what I can gather. But it is to the movie because the movie is creating the myth.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think I'd prefer the story of a man who didn't really give a shit until he met someone and then had his eyes opened. Because that's the story of Wilberforce. That's how Wilberforce didn't care until the abolitionist movement sort of approached him.
Yeah.
And he's the one we credit in the UK with the abolition of slavery.
Yeah.
But again, for the point of a movie and for the point of myth making, it absolutely makes sense that they make this child anti-abolitionist and his best friend a black boy.
Yeah.
It also, then what they do, they can explain the closeness of these two men without having to go into, he was Lincoln's basically personal servant and he was a paid hand. And get it into the woods with all that. If they completely remove that, give them a childhood history, they're just best friends and that,
I've got to come back on something Native Atheist put in the chat. Now, he may have stated something like that, but I think most of the evidence we can see is that Abraham Lincoln did hold some Christian viewpoints. He certainly wasn't an atheist. He may not have necessarily been like a diehard Christian. He certainly wasn't an atheist either. So, because I'm just saying we got to be careful because I've seen some atheists try to claim Lincoln as one of our own, and that's most likely not the case.
Look, I think they said he was very much doctrine of necessity. He was a religious skeptic. Like, Lincoln was very skeptical of religion and the power of religion, and he was his approach to religion was like man knew how to write a speech.
Yeah.
Man knew how to write a speech and play to his audience's ideas and his audience's understanding. Like, if you want an 1800s audience to listen to you, you quote the Bible at them. That's how that goes down.
I mean, and I should say something about this. And again, this is about the historical Abraham Lincoln. One of the things people you've got to understand, if there is a politician in American history that is the absolute master pragmatist,
is Lincoln.
It absolutely is. I might sort of say one thing on what Noodle said. Now, I will say Lincoln actually weirdly did not have a good reputation as a great speaker during his lifetime. But there was those 2 or 3 speeches he made that were so fucking good.
Yes, but his speeches, he might not have been a great speaker, but when you read his speeches are technically brilliant.
Yeah. Let's put it this, but he probably made two of the greatest speeches in US history with the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah.
Let's put it this way, when it mattered, when he did have to deliver a great speech, he kind of like he doesn't. It's like he doesn't, like, in baseball terms, he doesn't always hit a home run, but when he did, he knocked it out the fucking park.
Yeah, exactly.
That
And the thing is that there are books you can buy of great American speeches, and it's very telling that some of Lincoln's speeches go in there alongside like the "I Have a Dream" speech and the "Ask not what your country can do for you" speech.
Yeah.
And you know these famous, like, America's very good at turning out good orators.
Or even the Churchill, we shall never surrender. We shall fight
Well,
them on the
that's
beaches.
not American, but yeah.
But you know,
we shall fight them on the beaches, and you know.
I'm sorry, I started on that little tangent before you said American. Actually, Noodle. That's,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, but this is what I'm getting at. Like Lincoln's, and this movie is very good at actually showing that. Like Lincoln uses the trappings of religion. He uses the silver because it was the 40 pieces of silver.
Yeah.
He uses he stays on holy ground, and while the vampires are looking for him, he uses the trappings of religion without ever necessarily professing a profound belief in it.
Yeah.
And that's what Lincoln does in his actual historical speeches. Like he talks about religion, he quotes scripture, he mentions providence multiple times. But he
I just realized something.
Go on.
This is the only vampire hunter media that I can think of where a cross is never used.
Exactly, and there's a reason.
Well, technically, Mary Lincoln uses one.
No, it's not a cross; it's a mini sword.
Oh, it's a
Yeah,
mini
it's
sword.
the
What she
sword.
puts down. I thought that.
Yes, no,
I was
it's
watching.
her son's,
Bear in mind,
it's her son's toy sword.
In our pre-show, I was watching on my phone. That's why it perhaps didn't look as.
Yeah, it's her son. It was
sword.
the silver sword from the toy soldier.
Now I did like I said, I watched the little video, the Lost in Adaptation one, just before we came on stream, and he did sort of say something about like that, how like with vampire stuff, like Hollywood's the way it's created its own vampire canon.
Yes, definitely.
With certain ideas that have survived, and certain things that have like. Now, it's interesting that the use of silver is an interesting one here, because this is a Hollywood invention, but it was actually invented around like werewolf mythology.
Yeah,
and it's an absolute Hollywood invention, and it seems like they've transposed this into the vampire kind of myth for this one. So
well, so is the mirror's invention. Like the idea that vampires can't be that's because old mirrors, like the process for making them included the use of silver. Modern mirrors don't have that.
Yeah.
So if you know any modern vampires, don't trust if you can see them in a mirror. But yeah, like he's, there are some quotes. I think was it Lincoln who said, "When I had nowhere else to go, I went to my knees." I'm sure that's a Lincoln quote. Like, I think
I'm going to Google that.
Yeah, I'm sure that's Lincoln. We're talking about a man like Lincoln famously suffered with depression all his life. And he talked about the black dog. That's where we get that imagery from, if for anyone who's curious. And I think with Lincoln, he was.
That is attributed to Abraham Lincoln.
It's attributed. But, I don't know if it's.
Yeah, and I because my favorite Lincoln quote of all time. The problem with quotes on the internet is you can never tell if they're actually accurate or not. Yes. Abraham Lincoln.
Yes. That was Einstein.
I'm telling you, that was Lincoln.
I'm telling you, it was actually,
okay,
no, it was Oscar Wilde.
Let's get back on track.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, the point I'm making is, right, regardless of Lincoln's professed religious belief, he lived in America in the 1800s. He was at the very least culturally Christian.
Yeah.
And in the same way, like, none of us are Christian. We're all culturally Christian. We all understand.
As much as I hate to admit it, you can't live in Britain. I don't think you can live in America without the cultural influence of Christianity.
Yeah, you can't. You can't live in the Anglosphere as a member of the majority culture without being culturally Christian.
I mean, look,
Look,
today's a
let's
national
be clear.
today's a national holiday in Britain. I'm sure it is in the United States. You know, today's
And that's a
a
Christian.
national holiday. Yeah,
It's like, how do you know if your religion is dominant? You get the day off work for its
Yeah.
big day. You don't see them giving Muslims Eid off work.
this is why we have this is why every time we have the new atheist have to try and say the Christians stole it for the pagans, even when historically it's a little difficult to prove.
Do you see my expression right now?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just sorry. I've had this argument with someone yet again today, and they quoted quoted fucking Zeitgeist as a source to me.
Scummer, why do you do it to yourself? Just leave them. Don't give them the satisfaction of crucifying you. Just
I don't know. Partially because I'm an atheist content creator, and I want my side to do a little bit better. And secondly, because I hate myself and I'm a raving masochist.
Yeah. You know, if Easter was actually stolen from the pagans, then, you know, Abraham Lincoln actually was a vampire hunter.
It's about as accurate, yeah. But yeah. And then we get this scene of his childhood with this slaver, whoever, beating on the boy, him jumping in and his parents following. And there's a really interesting moment, and we get this repeated. It happens once or twice at the start of the film, and it's interesting, where the father tells him, look away.
Yeah.
He tells him, look away when your friend is being whipped, and he tells him, look away when your mother is dying.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to go back to what I was saying a minute ago, then I'll carry on with my point. Native, you can reject cultural Christianity till you're blue in the face. You're still part of it, whether you like it or not, unfortunately. Yeah. All you can do is unlearn it and do your best to live outside of it. Yeah, sorry. I just had to say that. But yeah, this tells him look away. And in both situations, and it's so important that he does it, that Abraham doesn't.
Yeah.
Because what that does is that creates a character, and it feeds in again to this Lincoln myth of the man who refused to look away, the man who refused to allow this to happen and to turn a blind eye.
Yeah.
And it goes from being he refused to watch a child being beaten, to he refused to watch his mother being harmed, to he refused to stand by and look away as slavery went on.
Yeah.
And that's what it feeds into, and it doesn't say explicitly, but that's the myth it's feeding into.
Yeah.
And that's where we sort of we develop this character very early on. And the thing is, unfortunately, right, movies like this, a lot of people watch movies like this and think they are actually historical lessons. Yeah. And I don't mean historical lessons as in teaching you to think. I mean historical lessons as in there will be people out there who genuinely believe that Abraham Lincoln had a childhood black friend who he defended from a man trying to whip him. There will be people out there who believe that. Because it suits the narrative, it fits in with the mythology. And therefore they don't question it, because why would you? Why would you question that the great emancipator defended a boy from a man with a whip?
Yeah.
You don't, because it feeds the narrative. You know, and then we see him grow up and we get our training montage. Very stereotypical underdog and master learning to fight the big bad training montage.
Yeah.
Like, that's just every training montage that's ever been made. And obviously it's with an axe. And the idea of he's this working class boy who brought himself up from nothing, very bootstrap theory, very American dream.
And, you know, Lincoln did work for several years as a rail splitter.
He did. And the thing is with Lincoln is, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, one of the token bootstrap theories.
Yeah.
Because the thing about propaganda and the thing about something like the American dream is that, look, the line goes, the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
the pursuit, not the achievement, not the right to, but the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
And what that means is that if 1 in 1,000 do it, that's enough to keep to keep the flame alive, to keep the belief alive. It's the same reason people play the lottery.
Yeah.
You get a winner once in a while and it keeps people playing. You've probably got a better chance of winning the lottery than achieving the American dream.
Yeah.
But Lincoln was one of the few who made it. Started out as, poor boy, couldn't read, couldn't write, poor parents, taught himself to read, taught himself to write. And there is this element of, yes, absolutely, he was a kid in a million, a man in a million to get to where he went. From being a real splitter to being present. Yes, absolutely. I'm not arguing that. But this is part of the American mythos. Like every, there's a reason Elon Musk likes to pretend he was born in poverty. There's a reason J.K. Rowling likes to pretend that she spent time in poverty. She understands what poverty is. It's because it feeds that narrative. And when you come from poverty and you've made it, it infers a level of virtue on you.
Yeah.
An assumed virtue on you from your audience. In Lincoln's case, I think absolutely deserved, but not to the detriment of remembering that he was a human being with human faults.
Yeah.
And that he was as much part of the system as he was trying to break it and build something better.
Yeah.
And
it also gives us the information of how vampires work in this setting.
Yes, it does.
Where,
and again, it's a really good
silver, they can go out in the sun, but they have to be protected from it.
Yeah. Even to the point that when he goes to the pharmacy to find the pharmacist in Springfield, the sign outside the pharmacy is basically for suntan lotion.
Yeah.
Like it's subtle, but it's there. They can make themselves invisible, so you throw rice or flour. They can move superhumanly fast, so you've got to be at least as fast. You've got to be fit, you've got to be strong. And you've got to pull yourself up from nothing. And it's so important that when he starts out, he doesn't know any of this and he has to learn it. And it's only through learning. Because again, that feeds into that American bootstrap, American dream theory of if you try hard enough, you will achieve.
Yeah.
And there's nothing to stop you but yourself.
Yeah.
Which is nonsense. But, what can you do? And there's a great bit where he's chopping at the tree. And they're talking about what makes you angry. What do you hate? What do you hate? What do you hate? And at the end, it says, power is not from hate, it's from truth.
Yeah.
Which, again, Abe Lincoln famously, very, honest Abe. Again, complete nonsense, but honest Abe.
Look, come on, honest Abe, he was a lawyer.
He was a lot. Thank you. Glad you said it, Scummer. But yes, honest Abe. And therefore, you get this, but also the line it delivers of you. That's not truth. That is not the truth that makes him powerful and angry in that moment. Because what made him angry enough to cut that tree was I was too small and too weak to protect my mother.
Yeah.
That's not a truth. That's a psychiatrist's wet dream.
I see when I was watching that scene, I thought here's where I thought it was going to go to. What do you hate? What do you hate? I was just waiting for the word slavery to come up. That's what I was waiting for.
But it didn't have to say slavery because what he hated was the man who killed his mother, the man who beat his black friend. It's implied.
It's implied.
And that's where propaganda is so powerful and so clever because you assume that word is there and you apply it to that scene without it ever having to be said out loud.
Which in a way is kind of glad why he didn't, the word slavery wasn't uttered in that sentence, which is why I'm kind of glad because, as you said, it was implied, but
and it's this thing of he has to learn that revenge is not the answer, and he's basically, and I can't believe these words are coming out my mouth, he has to learn the difference between narrow self-interest and the greater good.
Yeah.
His narrow self-interest is revenge. The greater good is bringing down all the vampires, not just one.
Yeah.
And it's a very paragon of virtue, hero's journey kind of message. Like, it's in every piece of media you've ever seen in your life.
Yeah.
It's nothing new. But it is there, and the whole point of he's cutting down the tree. And if you see the way he cuts the tree as well, he cuts it halfway, and then the rest of the tree just sort of the way it cuts, like that's not how you cut a tree down.
Yeah.
Like that's not what that's for. Like if you cut a tree down that way, you'd probably kill someone. That's not how. Like, when have you ever seen the stump from a tree being cut, being like halfway, and then the rest of it just broken at a wonky angle?
Yeah.
Like, when have you ever seen that? Like, he's clearly not a competent tree cutter. That's not his job.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was that point. And yeah, but that's all based on, the whole look away, don't look away dichotomy that you see.
Yeah.
And the idea of hate versus truth. And that does create that thing of hate versus truth. That's a very modern sensibility.
Yeah.
And that's a very modern left-wing sensibility of you hate, you are a bigot, you are a racist, you support slavery, or you support the truth.
Yeah.
That's a very modern sensibility. And that's there for the benefit of the modern audience, not for any of that. That's what that's there for. Let's be clear here.
Yeah.
Like, the whole point it's getting at there is you cannot hate, you cannot be a bigot, and also pursue the truth. And you know what they say? You shall know the truth.
And the truth shall set you free.
Which is ironically the motto of the CIA.
Irony 101.
Yeah. They knew exactly what they were doing.
See, I disagree. See, like I think you can I think you can hate two things simultaneously. Actually, that I can hate bigotry against LGBTQ people. At the same time, I can also hate Bud Light and Anheuser-Busch. But
yeah, I mean, like, I don't have to drink Bud Light, do I? Like, I don't have to, do I?
No.
Like, it's not. There's not like. Okay, good.
I mean, it is the only drink I can finish without getting completely blackout drunk.
Darling, if you drank enough water, you'd probably get blackout drunk.
See, here's the thing. You say you drink Bud Light, and here's the thing. I can still say to you, in all good consciousness, that you've never drunk beer.
Yes. Well, actually, to be fair, I prefer like cider and fruit based drinks.
Actually, to be fair, I think root beer has a better claim to that title than Bud Light anyway. So,
Ring, didn't you get a taste for Carling black fruits while you were in England because it was all they had on tap that was sweet?
Yeah. Or Strongbow, Strongbow Dark.
Strongbow.
Same thing. Carling Strongbow, it was the same thing. It was just.
One's a bad lager, one's a bad cider.
But we get this training montage and we get the establishment of always have a contingency plan. Which is brilliant. And
can I just say we can play a drinking game. We can play a drinking game with that in this movie. Contingency. We could have a drink. We could play a drinking game to that in this movie.
And if we did it with Bud Light, we might actually get hydrated. Yeah, it's this idea of always have a contingency. It's a beautiful classic action movie trope, isn't it? Like the one lesson, like it's It's this movie's wax on, wax off.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's like
Yeah.
it's the one. If there's one lesson you should take from this movie, it's always have a contingency plan. Like,
And
that's what that's there for.
so the scene with the pharmacist is probably one of the few like suspenseful scenes of this movie.
Yeah, and I will say, like, I just look. There's always have a contingency plan, and then there's pure dumb luck.
Yeah.
Like, okay, you that was not having a knife in your belt in case you got roped up by the legs is not fucking a contingency plan.
Yeah.
That's pure dumb luck. I mean, it's hyper competence plus pure dumb luck, which is the classic action hero equation.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a lot of the fight scenes in this. Look, the fight scenes are designed again to mythologize the character, like, and it's established very quickly that vampires have superhuman strength. Never said explicitly, but it is established very quickly.
Yeah.
And there are, like, the way the vampire keeps humans, like, if you notice in the basement,
Yeah.
the people who were hanging there,
Yeah.
like, there's a reason it's the film the way it is. It's like most of the film focuses on the black man at his other side, who's barely alive.
Yeah.
In that scene, but also it's reminiscent of things like it's reminiscent of what we probably think of when we think of things like, you know, satanic rituals and the satanic, you know, that kind of thing. It's deliberate, like, it's Christian without explicitly stating a Christian worldview.
Yeah.
It's culturally Christian. Like 3 people hanging and bleeding to death.
Yeah.
I mean, it is Easter Sunday.
Yeah.
Just saying. I mean, you know, this is there for a reason. You know, the idea of there is no reason that one person accepting 40 pieces of silver 2,000 years ago to betray someone should have put a curse on all silver.
Yeah.
There's no reason for that, but that's a culturally Christian idea. This is what I mean by it presents Abe in this as a pragmatic cultural Christian. Like, he uses the trappings that work for him and leaves the rest to one side.
Yeah.
Like, you see him when his son's dying later on in the film. He's sat at the side of the bed and he's shown to be praying. But it's never said explicitly that he's praying. He's just knelt at the side of the bed with his hands clasped. So if you want to view him as praying, you can. Or you can just view it as this is a stressed out father thinking and just holding his hands there. But there's no reason to sit there like that, like, if you're not praying. And this film is very good at walking that line between... Because, again, this is, first and foremost, a propaganda film feeding into the myth of Lincoln.
Yeah.
And it's so important, especially in the 21st century where this is released, 2012, that Lincoln is not a devout Christian.
Yeah.
Because 2012, it's the first time we're seeing culturally in America that religion is potentially on a decline. We're seeing that that people are now beginning to realize that religion is being used as a dog whistle for bigotry.
Yeah.
And so it's so important that Lincoln is kept separate from that. And he's almost above that without alienating either side of the argument.
Yeah.
Like, it's the same reason, like, why do you think Americans got so wound up at the idea of Biden being a Catholic?
Now, so I was gonna bring this up later when we got to the plantation, but do you think this is also why they didn't muddy the metaphor, or they kept the vampire, the vampires or slaveholders from the book without also adding the, capitalists are vampires from the book.
I think partially, yeah. Probably partially.
Yeah. And also, I think partially because there's just only so much you can put into a film.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, I think obviously a lot of this, look, they're obviously cutting this down to like an hour and 3/4 film. Okay.
Yeah.
We've spent an hour and a half on this already, and like have still not kind of scratched. We still only really scratched the surface of the actual film.
Yeah, and also, most movie audiences aren't really going to a film called Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter for nuanced metaphor.
No.
Exactly.
No.
It's there if you want to see it, but that's not what this movie is. No. It's not what this movie is for, basically.
Yeah.
At least for the majority of the audience. And that's important as well. But there's a reason this montage calls back to Rocky, to all those famous training montages. It's because that's what the audience wants. That's what you expect in a action film. But it also it does something with Lincoln that's really interesting. It takes Lincoln and it establishes him as the underdog.
Yeah.
As the trainee, as the kid who, starts out with nothing and only through his own hard work becomes the best.
Yeah.
And that, again, very American, appears in movie tropes all the time. But you'll see, when you see, like, if your character, like, you can always tell who the hero is in any given action movie because they're the ones who get a training montage. Like, that's what that's for.
Yeah.
And the point of that is not just to establish them as having trained to be the best. It's to establish them as they weren't always this good.
Yeah.
And they had to work for it. And what makes them this good is not that they were born to it, it's that they learned and earned from it. For a brilliant example of this, Goku in the Dragon Ball Z series. Goku starts out as this, he's supposedly really powerful on Earth, but when the other Saiyans show up, it turns out that he's some 2-bit nobody who's weak even for a Saiyan. In the end, though, he's the one who ends up going Super Saiyan before Vegeta, who is the prince of the Saiyans.
Yeah.
Because he puts the work in. And Vegeta doesn't, because Vegeta assumes it's his birthright. It's that same cultural idea of you have to work for it, you have to earn it. And if you work for it and earn it, you can be better even than the people born to it. That's what training montages feed into and play into.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Just take the lesson of you have to work for it and earn it without taking the because you worked for it, you will get it, because that's not how life works.
Yeah.
And that's when it veers into bootstrap theory.
Yeah.
And what we see as well as Lincoln develops, we see him as very much the product of his associates.
Yeah.
Which is the next bit I want to get onto. Like, every major quote in this movie from Lincoln, every major thing he says is something his mother said, or his wife said, or his friend said.
Yeah.
It's not an original thought of his own. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being the kind of person who learns from the people around you.
Yep.
But like, for example, the whole thing of the quote from his mother of, "Oh, no one is free until all are free."
Yeah.
That quote permeates this movie, but he'd heard it from his mother first.
Yeah.
You get things Mary says that he then says later on in different contexts. You get things Will says that he says later on in different contexts.
Yeah, things Henry says that he, says in a different.
verbatim, yeah.
Yes.
And it's the idea of man as the product of his associates. And that's why in this movie in particular, I don't particularly mind that they gave him the childhood friendship with Will rather than meeting him as an adult, because the consequence is the same.
Yeah.
The consequence is a man who learns from the people around him and understands that just because he's the one in power, just because he's the one in the limelight, that the people around him are giving him nuggets of wisdom that will stand the test of time, and he hears them and he listens to them.
Yeah.
Do I believe that the real Lincoln, who went to Springfield, Illinois, and went from being just wanting to be a lawyer to getting very political, meeting his Black Valley and suddenly caring about abolition, do I believe that that's probably accurate to his character? Absolutely. Do I believe he was told it by a vampire hunter? Probably not. You know, like, it's one of those things. But there's a few things, like the horse chase scene.
Yeah.
Look, he didn't kill a puppy, but he threw a horse, so he's villain of the month.
Yeah, he's not quite Sandman level, but
no, he's not. But he did throw a horse, so
yeah,
he still threw a horse.
That being said, like the horse chase scene is the one scene in this movie that like where I'm kind of like taken out of the movie by how over the top it is.
Yeah, very much so.
To be honest, this is where I was thinking to myself, this is where we need an Abraham Lincoln versus John Wick crossover.
Honestly, I think John Wick could struggle if this is the Abraham Lincoln we got.
Yeah.
But there's another thing this movie does really well. Every Chekhov's gun it puts down, it fires.
Yeah.
Like, he goes to see Miss Tubman, and then she appears later on. Every Chekhov's gun fires.
Yeah, I was like, oh, they had to get Harriet Tubman in there.
They had to, didn't they?
Yeah.
And again, that's how mythologies are born. They incorporate real life, and that's the difference between a legend and a history, or a myth and a history. You know, this is why Robin Hood fought in the Crusades, not because Robin Hood fought in the Crusades, but because it anchors him to a moment in history. That's why he fought King John, who was real and existed, because it anchors him to a moment in history. In the same way, if Abraham Lincoln, vampire hunter, dropped in on Harriet Tubman in a church while trying to escape from vampires, that anchors that moment in history.
To be honest, actually,
it gives him the link to the Underground Railroad so he can use it later.
To be honest, before we went on stream, obviously we're talking. He's like, okay, we've mentioned all these like action heroes: Abraham Lincoln, you know, Vampire Hunter, John Wick, Chuck Norris, Teddy Roosevelt. I'm going to say this: Harriet Tubman would have fucked all of them up. I'm going to say this right now.
Ain't no messing with Harriet Tubman.
Yeah.
You know, I'm waiting for the inevitable superhero matchup of Harriet Tubman and Mary Seacole.
Yeah.
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 For anyone who hasn't heard of Mary Seacole, British nurse, Crimean War, loved more than Florence Nightingale by the soldiers she was treating.
Well, it's hardly surprising. Oh, God. I could go on a rant about Nightingale, to be honest.
Extra History actually has a series on her life.
Yes.
She was brilliant. She was actually turned down to be one of Florence Nightingale's nurses because she was Jamaican, and then she went out there anyway on her own money.
Florence Nightingale's like casualty rates in her in her hospital, one of the fucking worst in the Crimean War.
Yeah.
So now there is one thing about the movie that I don't like. Like one of the things in the movie that hits my plot hole annoyance button is how pissed Mary Todd gets when she discovers the truth, even though he
literally
told her.
told her.
Yeah, he literally told
This
her,
is
"I
the-
hunt vampires," and she didn't believe him.
Oh, ha ha ha! I'm like, this is a joke, kind of like, you know. Yeah, it's just because this is around the death of Tad, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now we know Tad died of something akin to smallpox because Lincoln caught it.
Yeah.
As we said earlier, Will died of it. There's a lot of things that go on in and around the White House that are really interesting. So there's the line when he's discussing with Henry, and they're in they're in the main voting area.
Yeah.
And they're talking about, Henry saying, look, people are dying. People, this is why the South has to exist to keep them contained. And Will says, so you get to live. You get to choose which men live or die. And then Abe says, no, this is for mankind. Well, this is for the future of mankind. And Henry responds with the famous last words, not all mankind. Which is so obviously a line designed for a modern audience.
I know
Henry's not a racist. Yeah. Like, if there's one thing in this movie is that Henry's not a racist.
Yeah.
So for that line to come out of his mouth is just so fucking weird.
Yeah.
Like, if you want to talk about plot holes, let's talk about that line.
Yeah.
Because line
it almost feels like it's what I said about Lincoln being like the pragmatist here. It almost feels like Henry's the real pragmatist in this, and Lincoln's the idealist.
Lincoln is very much an idealist in this, but the thing is, Lincoln has, and this is what a lot of historical movies do as well. They give their protagonists, their historical protagonists, modern sensibilities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because let's be honest, the real Lincoln, who by modern standards, emancipator or not, was a racist, would not be a actual sympathetic protagonist for a modern audience, especially in 2016, 2012, Obama in the White House. Lincoln, as he was in real life, is not a sympathetic protagonist for a lot of audiences.
And his thing, I'll just say it's a bit more historical information. Lincoln did not run on an abolitionist ticket in 1860. He ran on a platform of stopping the spread of slavery, because there's the whole, obviously, the Manifest Destiny thing, which is drawing this line, across this like slave state. This is
from Mason to Dixon.
Here's the thing: everybody knows America's expanding. Okay, here's the thing with the thing that the South understood: America's expanding. If we stop the spread of slavery, suddenly our states are going to be in a minority. So it was like, okay, Lincoln's running on a platform of stopping the spread of slavery, but ultimately that means long term, somewhere down the line,
the destruction of slavery.
They're not getting there, because I think it's hilarious how the South. Yeah, sorry, I'll keep rant about this.
The point you're making there, and I'm going to build on it and try and elaborate on it a bit, but if I'm wrong, please correct me in what I'm saying. Cool. The point is that prior to the American Civil War, they had the 3/5 compromise. And what the 3/5 compromise meant is that no matter how populated the non-slave states in the US got, they were never going to outnumber the voting rights of the slave states, because of that 3/5 compromise that said that slave masters could vote on behalf of their slaves who were classed as 3/5 of a person. It's only as America begins to expand and the potential for a population that would outnumber the voting rights, not the people, not even the voters, but the voting rights of the southern states, that it becomes a serious political issue for the South.
I mean, because ultimately, if you think about it, if there's a platform of America expanding, but we're saying, listen, slavery is now is confined to these 14 states or whatever.
Yeah, we're going to ring-fence it or whatever.
No, I know. Now, I listen. Just a little thing. I know only 11 states seceded, but you had several that stayed with the North: Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, were all slave states that happened to stay within the Union. But it was the whole thing realized is the South realized that if there is a stop on the expansion of slavery, if there's not this parity, eventually slavery is going to go.
Yeah, eventually they lose
they
the
knew
political clout of the Three-Fifths Compromise that gives them control of
they immediately
Congress.
lose the
Which
Three-Fifths,
is also
the
why there
Missouri.
was that whole plot with the Golden Circle that never actually went anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is that. Now, look, at the end of the day, you can understand what she meant by he'd never told her, because what she's getting at is, look, you never told me you were still doing this. You never told me this was the consequences of this. You never told me. You never sat down and honestly, like, you proposed to me rather than showing me that you were carrying a silver-tipped axe.
Yeah.
Like, you actively went out of your way to hide this from me, is what she's getting at there. So, yes, it's a plot hole, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, that whole not all mankind line just threw me out.
I guess that rubbed me the wrong way as well, I'll have to say.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And it's like this whole thing, like, and also like speed. Speed is set up throughout this movie for you to believe he's got a problem with Will.
Yeah.
Like, if I was going to, okay, the way Speed is set up, the way he looks funny at Will when he first meets him, the way he's a bit off, the way he seems to be kind of racist.
Yeah.
All the ways he does it. And this is what makes me laugh, right? Because white people claim they don't understand microaggressions. And yet, I'm pretty sure a white person, like, those are microaggressions.
Yeah.
The funny looks, the not quite, the tone as they shake hands, the lack of trust, the lack of camaraderie. They're all microaggressions. That's what a microaggression is. So if you can see why everyone assumed Speed was a racist right up until the end when it was proven he wasn't, you can understand microaggressions, because that's what you're noting. And take that media literacy that tells you that I see why Speed is a racist, and apply it to real life a little bit, because it's the same things.
Yeah.
Just as a, if you want to learn something from media this week, the proposal. I have opinions.
You have opinions about the proposal.
Well, no, I have opinions about the after. I have opinions about a split-second shot after the proposal.
Okay.
Because he makes the fatal error. And it's foreshadowing for how the movie plays out.
Yeah.
When he proposes to her, he takes her in his arms and he leaves the weapon behind. He leaves it by the door where he can't get to it in an emergency.
Yeah.
And he leaves himself vulnerable because he leaves his axe behind.
Yeah.
And that's it's symbolic, but it's there, and it's very much everyone will always, like, you see in a lot of media, like, people who believe they are so safe. Like, he thought the vampires didn't know who he was.
Yeah.
People who believe they're so safe, they get cocky. And that's what he did in that scene. He got cocky. He got so cocky that he left his weapon by the unlocked front door to carry her to bed.
Yeah.
And that is his ultimate downfall.
Yeah.
Like, it's very, very subtle, but it is there. And that's kind of why I have opinions on that scene, because this is what it really annoys me. Okay, this is what writers do, and it's such a lazy trope. Like, yeah, you're trying to say my hero got cocky, my hero has a weakness, this is my hero's weakness. But no person who is being hunted lets their guard down like that. No one's that stupid. I mean, other than Ring, who left their weapon in a restroom in Afghanistan for several hours, but that was different. But you don't do that. It's like, again, channel punching bag. James Potter left his wand on the living room table as he was going up to bed on the night that Voldemort happened to be attacking the house.
Yeah.
Like, and it's this weird, it's a really lazy thing writers do, and it makes the protagonist vulnerable for a bit. It's like, I fully expected that scene to end in an attack by the vampires on the property because he didn't have his weapon there. And he got so lucky. He was so lucky in that night.
Yeah.
Because that's the trope, and it does subvert the trope by not having them attack. And then you get the wedding, which... Look, Americans, I know the buildings are pretty. I know they're pretty. But please stop holding your weddings at plantations. Please. Please. I know they're pretty. I know they've got beautiful gardens. But those gardens are soaked in the blood of slaves.
Yeah.
So please stop holding your weddings there. It's disconcerting at best to your non-white friends, family, and loved ones. Please stop.
Yeah.
Like, seriously? Like, there's a reason you never see Pinterest weddings with black people having their weddings at plantations. Just put it... There's a reason Will was the only black person in that room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But speaking about plantations...
You couldn't have waited for me to swallow before saying that. Yeah. The attack or the whole thing. Look, there's a line I want to discuss, and I will preempt what I'm about to say with, I'm glad they put it in the mouth of the villain.
Yeah.
Because if they'd have put it in the mouth of the hero, I'd have lost my fucking shit. And I'm about to lose my shit on it anyway.
Yeah.
But I'm glad they put it in the mouth of the villain, because I'm about to lose my shit a little bit less.
Yeah.
Because at least they understand what they are saying is fucking nonsense, ahistorical, racist dog whistle bullshit. When he stands there and he says, I saw Egyptians build the pyramids and Christians eaten by lions and Africans sell their own as slaves. Oh boy, do I have opinions. Look, if the only lesson you took from learning about the transatlantic slave trade and the triangle and all of that is that Africans sold their own slaves, ding, 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 congratulations, you're a racist.
Yeah.
I'm not even arguing that point with you. If your only question about the slave trade is, but I thought Africans sold their own, you're a racist, because that's a dog whistle, and it's not even a subtle one, because what you're saying is, oh, so it was okay to keep for white people to keep Africans as slaves because other Africans sold them. No, the point is, it was all wrong, it was all bad, and just because they did it doesn't justify you doing it.
Yeah.
And also, they may have sold people as slaves to you. You were the ones who put them on plantations and worked and used their race as justification.
I'm glad you went there, Noodle, because I was. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Then. Okay. This may have been. Yes. I think there's enough historical evidence to say. Yes, that there were Africans who sold other Africans into slavery.
Absolutely, they sold.
No one's denying
prisoners, criminals. Yeah,
no one's denying this. But as you said, they still sold that. You know, it's kind of like a very simple. Two wrongs don't make a fucking right here.
Yeah. What it is when you ask that question. When you ask the question, but what about the Africans who sold slaves? The clues in the sentence. It's whataboutism.
Whataboutism, yeah. It's like, but who's they may have sold their own into slavery. They may have profited off of it. But who profited off this shit more? If there wasn't a fucking market for it to begin with from white colonialists,
Yeah.
It's not even about who profited more. The
Yeah.
point is that this was a moral and
Mm.
ethical quagmire. It doesn't matter who did it. It doesn't matter who profited from it. It was wrong. And you implied in the question, what about Africans who sold other Africans as slaves, is, oh, that makes it okay because they did it. No, it doesn't. It doesn't make it okay. It doesn't make it acceptable. And it doesn't make it culturally appropriate. Like, it may have, the Bible may have said slavery is okay. That, slavery may have been culturally normalized. That doesn't make it wrong. If you go back far enough in human history, cannibalism was normalized and culturally appropriate. It doesn't mean you're saving up great granny's leg for your Easter Sunday lunch, does it?
We're always getting into like domains of like philosophical topics on moral realism versus, like relativism here.
That's exactly what it is.
It's exactly what
moral
this is.
relativism.
Which is kind of, listen, and I'm just going to say this. I have my issue with this constant phone-ins with Dillahunty or whatever on like the Atheist Experience or the Line or whatever he's on now, where the slavery in the Bible thing comes up. But I find it very funny. I do honestly find it very funny when I hear Christian apologists come on and say, you have no moral, you have no objective morality as being an atheist. They're talking about moral realism. And immediately you bring up slavery in the Bible, they go to moral relativism. Well, yeah, but at the time, slavery was seen as like...
Because even the Catholic Church, after abolition, held its hands up and says, well, how were we supposed to... You're supposed to be the arbiter of moral truth.
Yeah, and I hate to use like Dillahunty as a reference point on this.
There is a difference.
He's correct on this.
When you're studying history, and anyone who knows me will have seen that I've said this on Twitter, and I said it on a few streams as well. You can't judge the past by our standards.
Yeah.
You can't. You have to judge them by their own. But, I say this, but that doesn't mean that certain things aren't morally reprehensible no matter when they happened.
Exactly.
Well, like the ancient Romans, it was totally normal for them to invade other countries and murder and enslave the women and children. That was morally reprehensible then, and it's morally reprehensible now. Just because it was normal then doesn't mean it should. And if you are asking the question now about something that was normalized in the past but is not still normalized, what you are saying is that you don't agree that it should ever have been abolished. That's what you are saying with that question. Because what you're saying is, if you're saying, but what about? If you are asking that question now, with the benefit of hindsight, with the benefit of a modern education, and with the benefit of a culture that doesn't normalize that behavior, what you are saying is that you see a valid reason for that behavior to have taken place.
I mean, essentially, listen, this is the thing. To put this into a sentence, anyone who says, what about black on black slave trade or whatever, this is not the fucking gotcha that you think it is. You're still a fucking racist if you're using that as a...
I guarantee you that the Venn diagram between people who say, what about Africans who sold Africans and what about black on black shootings is a fucking circle.
Yeah.
But
like that's what that is.
Yeah.
Okay. And look, if you don't understand why racism is wrong in 2023, I can't help you. I'm trying, but there's only I can only open the door. You've got to walk through it. And the thing is, right, there's this. I remember something came up in my Facebook memories recently. There was a worksheet in a school, and someone said, and one of the worksheets, it was a list the pros and cons of a thing. List the pros and cons of the British Empire. And I agree that worksheet should exist and should have been made. I absolutely agree that you should make children sit down and try and think of the positive impacts and the good reasons to have an imperial power and an empire. Because if they don't know the arguments for it, how the hell are they ever going to know how to argue against it? It's the problem we have now. We raised the generation to know that racism is bad and Nazism is bad. But the average early 20s person cannot tell you why. They can just tell you that a Nazi is bad. They don't understand why. And that's a problem, because when people don't understand why, they begin to allow those ideas to return. And if people understood that when calling someone a Nazi, what you're saying is they're a bigot, they're genocidal, they don't like, they think, you know, Jews and black people are underclassmen and LGBT people should be murdered. If they don't understand that that's what the word Nazi encompasses, then how the fuck are they ever going to stop Nazis rising again?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that point, because I mean, and I'll be honest, I'm one of the people. I'm always one of those people that's critical about don't overuse or go to calling someone a Nazi or a fascist straight away. I'm always one of those people that's be very careful how you use those words.
But if you don't understand what the words mean, how do you know how to use them?
And this is the thing, and I do think there's two sides to this. The you got to, obviously, I feel you've got to be careful how you use those words.
When I was an undergrad, and I did a module on slavery at undergrad, and there was a lesson on, you know, we were learning about the abolition movement and the arguments for and against and everything else. And he literally split us down the room and he said, right, you lot, you've got 15 minutes, both sides. You lot, I want an argument against slavery. You lot, I want an argument for it. One of you is going to stand up in this classroom and defend slavery. And he pointed at me and he said, you do it. You do it. I want you to stand up and defend slavery in this classroom. And I stood up and I did it. And I created an argument so airtight, I felt dirty doing it. I created an argument so airtight, I won that debate.
I'm going to say this.
But do you know what we took from that lesson? What we took from that lesson is it doesn't matter what your principles are. If someone stands up and they can create an argument airtight enough, you'll betray them. So you have to know what your principles are. You have to understand what underpins them. Because if the person opposite me in that classroom had have just used their brain and not assumed that they were going to win that argument just on the basis of slavery is bad, but couldn't explain why, they'd have won that debate. But because I stood there and I said, actually, no, there are economic reasons and there's this and there's that. And I sounded oh so reasonable and oh so calm and oh so, you know, it was obviously it's acceptable. The Bible says, you know, when people, you can turn people's opinions on it. And literally that class voted. The teacher said at the end, I want you to vote based purely on the arguments you've been presented today for or against slavery. There were 28 people in that classroom. 24 of them voted in favor of slavery on the basis of the arguments we presented. Because the other side of the classroom thought they got the easy argument and thought they could just stand up and say, well, of course, slavery is bad. They're human beings. But that's not an argument. That doesn't, they could have torn my arguments apart. They could have talked about how economically it's more expensive to keep slaves than not. They could have talked about, you know, the moral of it. They could have talked about the ethics of it. They could have talked about the cost of shipping people from Africa, the language barrier. They could have talked about so much, and they didn't because they thought they'd won. And this is the same problem the left in politics has. We assume because we're on the right side of history, we don't have to argue our point. And that's the lesson I took from that lecture. And that's what that lecture intended, to teach us that you cannot sit back on your laurels and assume that because you're right and you are morally correct that you're going to win, because you're not.
And I'm going to say, I had a very similar experience. I've got a very, very similar story to you, Noodle, of so an exercise I was given in school, and it was a hypothetical thing that, like, we're going to, I think it was like build a nuclear power plant on just outside the school. And I had to argue, like, because this was in an era when, like, should we say, environmentalism was getting big for the first kind of time.
Yeah.
I was charged with the try and make an argument why this is a good thing. And I had to bring it up. Say, well, but I had to go to all these things that other people hadn't thought about, like about bringing jobs to the area, boosting the local economy.
It's more efficient than coal.
And exactly. Exactly. I had to go to all those arguments, and all those was, but the environment, but
but human beings, but lives, but economy, and that's what I mean. If the person in that lecture I was in had just stopped to think and had actually lent credence to the arguments that would be made against it, they could have destroyed it.
Yeah.
But they didn't, because they assumed that just being morally correct was enough. It's not.
It's
you
not.
have to be able to destroy the enemy at its core. And this is the problem.
To be honest,
I see of the great emancipator as well.
I see it, and I see this on a daily basis. Even with some shit I've seen going on in the last 24 hours, I've seen this. And I'm not going to reference what it is, just so anyone.
No, but we. You know what? We made that mistake when Corbyn was running for Prime Minister. We assumed, because we had a good man with principles, who would stand up for the working classes, that we were eschewing. We assumed that would be, we would win that election, and there would be a socialist change in the UK. And so instead of, and we said, no, we're not going to argue with you because we're right. And we thought we were above it. And so we didn't give credence to the accusations of anti-Semitism or to the arguments of, the Tories destroyed Corbyn's platform, not on anti-Semitism, but on it's pie in the sky, where's the money coming from? And even when we had an answer, the answer was not presented forcefully enough to undermine what they'd already done to undermine the point.
Yeah.
And the answer came too late. And this is the point. If you're going to present an idea, no matter how obvious you think it is, prove it. Make sure you can back that shit up.
And can I just take 2 seconds to plug a little video of mine? Please go to God the Scummer channel. Okay, check my last video out. But can I just say a big fuck you to Keir Starmer and the Labour Party right now for the adverts they're running? Can I just say that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but
it's a total side tangent, but
the reason
go on.
The reason I brought up the plantation scene is, well, one, it's an important scene in the movie because it's the hinge where, Abraham Lincoln decides to take his vampire hunt national.
And he takes it to them, not them to him. Yeah.
And secondly, it's where the metaphor of the movie is slapped in the face, for anyone who didn't get it beforehand.
Yeah, like it stops flattering you with you know what we're talking about, really. We're talking about the fact that slave owners are actually like cockroaches and vampires and sucking on the blood of slaves to survive because they're nothing more than vermin and parasites.
Yeah.
Like it takes that, and it flattered you up until this point in the movie if you got that's what it was saying. And then this scene just sort of went, no, they're parasites and we're going to prove it. And we're going to show them to be parasites with too many teeth and viciousness, and it's going to be horrendous, and you're going to love it because you're going to be, you like, if you didn't think they were monsters, you know they're monsters now.
Yeah.
But again, it does that. And this is the whole point I was just making when I climbed up on my soapbox for a moment there of this movie at no point grapples with the arguments for slavery.
No.
Yeah.
And there were arguments for slavery. There were arguments. There were economic arguments. There were social arguments. There were cultural arguments. There were spiritual arguments for slavery as much as they were for abolition. But it never once grapples with them and never once allows the audience or the characters to actually stop and go, hang on, what are we actually fighting against? And I pointed this out last week as well. Superman did the same. We were told they were evil. we weren't told why. Like in this movie, it's very obvious they're evil because they kill people and suck their blood.
Yeah.
But then you get the thing of, well, so's Henry.
Yeah.
But everything Henry does, the only way you're allowed to be a vampire is to utterly rebel against everything a vampire is and to dedicate your time to hunting down vampires.
Yeah.
And it's this thing, and you know, and that again, it mythologizes the argument and utterly destroys any chance. Do you know the reason Henry's still picking people up in bars in 2012? It's because they never grappled with why the vampires existed in the 1800s.
Yeah.
And why they were so hell-bent on slavery. Because this whole movie, like, it insinuates but never says outright that slaves are kept as a fresh blood supply for the slave owners.
Yeah.
Like, that's what it's strongly
It's very much there's an allegory going on throughout this movie of you know, the vampires are slave owners kind of thing, and they're the ones sucking, you know, they're the ones, you know, like sucking on
the life, sucking the life out of
not of human beings, but sucking the life out of America. As a, you know, it's very much an allegory for going on here.
Yeah, it is. And but that's the point. At no point, like, because when you look objectively at slavery, right? When you look at the numbers and the economics and everything else, it didn't pay.
Yeah.
Like, the only reason the South wasn't bankrupt several decades earlier was because of slavery. But even then, it was hanging on by a thread.
Yeah.
Like, it was like the South was well bankrupt. Like, there's very little economic argument for slavery. There's very little, like, the social arguments weren't there, the cultural arguments weren't there, and so it is almost this sense of, well, there had to be some secret, there had to be something the people who were pro-slavery knew or wanted out of slavery that we're just not getting, because why would you support it otherwise? Because it just logically it makes no sense, which is why I was so surprised when I had to debate it and I won that debate, because you could destroy that debate in 10 seconds flat. But, you know, socially it wasn't right, culturally it wasn't right, biblically it wasn't right. And it does make you think, like, did they want slaves because they were secretly feeding on their blood? Because, like, in the argument of why would you support slavery, that's honestly as good a reason as any other. It makes as much sense.
This is as good a time as to bring up for Ring to bring up the point that was in the book that wasn't in the film.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think this is as good of a point. Yeah.
Because it and the idea of it's a very it's and again it's this thing we do on the left, like, everyone who disagrees with us, everyone who's on the right is a vampire, is a parasite, is a bigot, is a Nazi, is a fascist. No, they're human beings and they have a different political viewpoint to us. And if you can't sit down and talk to them, like, you don't have to tolerate their bigotry, you don't have to but sometimes you do need to sup with the devil, only to find out what he wants.
And this is, and to be honest, this is why, like, I've got criticism from people, for certain people I talk to, and I happen to even get on with on a personal level that who widely different political views to me, and like stand pretty much against a lot of the things I stand against. It's mainly a lot of it is partially, I want to know where they're coming from. I want to understand where they're coming from. There's been the odd few cases where we've been able to find a common ground, which has been helpful. You know, okay.
Plus, there's also the old adage of, look, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. I want to know what those fuckers are thinking. There's a reason I keep an eye on what the Daily Mail are running as their headlines. Yeah, it's not because I give a shit. It's because I want to know what they're thinking.
Yeah. Okay. Like, as the ultimate NCO's guide to, you know, like, sort of the whole know thy enemy. Like, it's a bit like the old ultimate, like, you know, I don't know if that's a Machiavelli or Sun Tzu quote, honestly.
Yeah, the
Sun Tzu probably said something similar.
the Sun Tzu quote is like, if you know, it's point A, point B, and then if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you will always win.
Yeah.
Of course, the veteran knows that because it's on the U.S. Army reading list.
Well, I'm going to say, this is a detour again. Ring said the best thing I've ever fucking seen on Twitter, and because I have read The Art of War or whatever a number of times. Ring just, I think, knocked it on the head. This is the first time in history when NCOs actually got officers to understand basic common sense.
Yeah.
The Sun Tzu's Art of War.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. Sun Tzu's Art of War, if you read Machiavelli, 99% of it is basic common sense, and the rest of it is chess tactics.
Yeah.
War hasn't fundamentally changed.
Maybe go tactics in Sun Tzu's case, you could argue, but yeah.
But it's like you don't play chess by telling your opponent what you're going to do next, do you?
No.
Or any game, any oppositional game, you don't play Risk by telling your opponent what you're going to do. You don't play backgammon, or you don't even play poker by telling your opponent what you've got in your hands.
Well, actually,
whoa, 3 aces, dude.
Yeah. Actually, like you do, like, there is a bit of risk where you are telling your opponents what you're going to do, because everyone is against everyone, and there are temporary alliances over the course of a game.
Yeah, but you still don't reveal your true motivations, do you?
Yeah.
It's like, I play against you in Risk all the time. You use turtle tactics, and I still can't beat you when you do that. I know what you're doing, and I still can't beat you.
I'm amazed. I'm just amazed from knowing you for both as long as I do. I am really amazed to find out that I would have thought Noodle would have fucked Ring up on Risk, but
no,
I'm very surprised.
The problem is I play historical battle things, whereas Ring plays the actual strategy of the game.
Yeah, let's put it this way. I think Rick. Even if you and I teamed up, I think Ring is going to fuck us up.
No, what it is, Ring takes over Australia, builds a base, and then moves out. Whereas me, I try and take Russia and Afghanistan and build out from there, because historically that's how you take over the world.
I guess technically I've always tended to build from Australia out, but
yeah, it's like I think Ring plays as Ring.
To be fair, even if we teamed up, we got to remember we are going against a military intelligence analyst here.
Look, the only time I have ever won against Ring at Risk was when I started with all my soldiers in Italy. Just saying.
Yeah.
the one time in history Italy didn't surrender. Yeah. I'm sorry. I had to get that joke in there.
Roman Empire. I followed the path of the Roman Empire, and that's how I won.
Yeah. I had to get that old joke in there.
But
it's not. And by the way, it's a joke. It's not true that Italians give up all the time. No, that's
the
joke.
French.
It's not. Yeah.
But no, I'm joking. I am joking. I love the French. Yeah. Sort of. No, I am joking. But yeah, and sorry, ignore that. It's the thing with this is, like, okay, he takes the battle to them, and you get this really hyper realistic battle. You've got Will being kept prisoner, and it's really interesting, like, again, how this movie plays with the expectations of the audience. As a modern audience, we know a black man being kidnapped and taken to New Orleans at this time, I don't end well for him. We know that.
Yeah.
Like, that really fucks with your perceptions, especially if you've ever seen Roots. Like, that's what that's playing into there.
Can I just do my one little bit of historical accuracy shit here?
Yeah, go for it. Why not?
They're welcome to take him to New Orleans. It's the one city in the South that the Union held. They're welcome to take him to New Orleans.
Well, to be fair, this scene was before the Civil War.
Yeah, this scene was before.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So like, if you were going to be kidnapped and taken to the South just before the Civil War in America, New Orleans is definitely where you wanted to end up, because that's your first chance at getting free again very quickly.
Yeah.
But it's like, Will was born in DC. Like, the actual William Harvey, what's his last name?
Yeah, William
Johnson.
Henry Johnson.
William Johnson was born in DC.
Yeah.
So very much a free man. But even that plays into our expectations of he's a northern black man. It's that fear of the unknown, and he will have grown up, and you see it in the way the characters are presented and the way Abe reacts to hearing he's been taken. It's that fear of, if we lose him within slavery, if he's sold into slavery, we will never find him again.
Yeah.
It's the same fear, I imagine, if you heard that, in 1943, if you heard that your Jewish neighbors had a knock on the door, like, it's that same fear of, we are never going to find them again. Like, they're gone. Like, we'll be very lucky if we ever find any record of them again. Polish neighbors in 1943. Yeah, we ain't finding them. Because and this is, and again, it's not said explicitly in this film, but I think it's worth us saying it explicitly here. The transatlantic slave trade was a genocide.
Yeah.
It was a genocide of Africans and African Americans.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important point to be made. People get lost in genocides. They get displaced. If you lose track of someone while a genocide is ongoing, you're never going to find them again.
Yeah.
Very difficult. There are still families in 2023 trying to find each other who were separated in 1940s Poland. And that's with the whole world trying to help them find each other.
Yeah.
There are still African Americans to this day who know their ancestors were slaves, but couldn't tell you what part of Africa their ancestors came from.
Yeah,
Couldn't tell you their ancestors' real names.
I'm trying to remember what it was. It might be. It was one of those like in like early 90s, one of those like really kind of cheesy teen school like comedy drama things like Saved by. It was something like Saved by the Bell. It was along those lines. But believe me, I'm just going to point this because there was a black character in this, because they were doing a thing about history, like tracing their ancestors and so on, and all these guys in there, and he was like, I can't trace any of my ancestors past slavery, and he was coming up against all these other kids like who could trace their ancestors back 600-700 years or whatever, and felt like he had to invent a thing where he come from African royalty.
Yeah, that rings a bell actually.
Yeah, I forget which one it was. It was either Saved by the Bell or California Dreams or something. It was one of those sort of shows and that era. Which, let's be honest, those shows don't often have anything powerful to say. But in this instance, they did, and it was just seeing this black student at the school or whatever trying to research it and feeling that he'd been kind of robbed of his heritage.
Yeah, I mean, we've had that discussion, Scummer, where I've said, I find it very strange that people I know can trace their family back more than a few generations. Like, I don't know. I only, by a quirk of luck, learned my own grandfather's name.
Yeah.
My own great-grandfather's name. I don't know my grandfather's name.
I have to say this.
Don't know, like, I can't trace my family in Poland back past the 30s. Like, I've tried, but I don't speak enough Polish.
And I even have to say, even in the sort of like somewhat somewhat privileged position that I might be in as a as a white male ever in Britain, I can only maybe get back 150 years before the timeline gets very skewed.
Yeah,
And
like,
there's not a clear link.
but,
And it's because you realise I've got ancestors who were in workhouses.
Yeah.
And that was a genocide of the poor by another name.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know about workhouses, if you ever do look into it, make sure you're feeling like you've got a strong stomach. It's horrendous.
Yeah, workhouses.
Oliver Twist is a freaking fairy tale to what the workhouses were really like.
And I have found this on at least two sides of my family, on my mother's side of the family and my father's side of the family. I try, like, my surname's Breeze, okay? I have traced it back like maybe 150 years. I think, and I can't even say this 100% with accuracy, that it may have been spelt BREESE at one time, and then it changed to a BREEZE at some time. But the biggest, longest guy back I can picture is a guy that I know with any degree of certainty was a guy called William Breeze from like the 1850s, 1860s.
Yeah, it's like my
who's in a workhouse, and that's the last time where it's like and that's the last point where there's a clear trail with my family history.
Yeah, it's like my mum was Jamaican Indian. We didn't know there were slaves in the family. My uncle, my cousin, my mum's cousin, I call him uncle, did a family history, went back far enough. He could only trace one branch of the family back more than 3 generations because of British colonialism in India. And the tree that he did manage to trace back was an actual Jamaican who he traced back to a slave on a Jamaican plantation, and then the records stop.
Yeah.
And it's like...
Although I'm sure if you go for ancestry.co.uk, eventually you'll find out you're descended from Alfred the Great, as everyone else is.
No. I've done Ancestry. My DNA on one side is Polish back to the 1300s. I don't know who these people were, but it's Polish back to the 1300s.
Well, I did Ancestry to get me to the point I got to, but I also cross-referenced it with like different sources to like get a clear trail, other than just you. Ancestry is like a good starting point to start tracing.
Very much so. But the point I'm making with Ancestry is Ancestry told me more about my family history than even if I could read Polish, Hindi, and all these South Asian languages as well. It told me more than I could probably ever find in any records, because those records just don't exist. And this goes back right to the start of this stream when I was talking about empirical history.
Yeah.
My history, and yours as well, Scummer, when you talk about family in workhouses, is stolen from you because people didn't write it down. And it's deliberate that they don't write it down, because they don't care about the poor and the minorities and the oppressed. So they don't write it down, and they become lost to history. That's why it matters so much. Like African Americans, it matters so much to them to have headstones. Like, it's such a big thing. Like, headstones are a big thing. Like, my family, it's like to have headstones, to have graves, to have church records. In Poland, one of the first things the Nazis did when they went into Poland was start destroying church records. What issue did they have with Catholics? None. But they destroy the church records because they destroy the history of the people.
But yeah, I mean, it's important, and I can see what it is. It's just important to you and your family, just for a headstone. Just like there's something there to say, hey, this person existed. Yeah. This person, and like I said, for the majority of us, this is what we maybe get as a headstone, or or something, or a plaque on a blooming park bench if we're lucky.
Yeah. What do you get? In memory of, name, date, rest in peace. That's empirical history. It doesn't tell you anything about the person. It just tells you that they lived.
I mean, like, one of the good things, and then sadly, even this thing was taken away. This was in one of my local pubs. Okay, was a guy called John who we knew. Like, he died like about 10, 15 years ago now. He's one of those guys, kind of guys you get in every English pub. That's the character of the pub.
Oh yes.
We called him Scouse John. He's from Liverpool, Scouse John. And it was kind of a big thing to us that, when he was, we got a plaque put up on this pillar on the bottom near the bar.
Probably.
But next to where he used to sit on the bar counter every day.
Because that says something about
and it
who
was
he
just
was
like,
as a person.
It was who's we did this thing because he used to always, and I hate Gone with the Wind, but he always used to like quote the "Frankly, my dear, I didn't give a damn." It was one of his, and so we put this plaque. We paid to get this plaque put up there on the wall in memory of Scouse John. Frankly, my dears, he didn't give a damn.
Yeah.
And then when the fucking refurbers come in there in 2014 and got in the pub, they got rid of the plaque. And it was like that little thing we remember of this character, this guy who was a real character in the pub, who was a bit of like a local legend. That little bit of him is gone.
Yeah.
Because the bloody corporations came in there. We got to remodel the pub. Let's get rid of this. And don't give a shit about what this thing is up on the wall here. Who the fuck's Scouse John?
Yeah, and that little bit of history is gone.
And it's a little sad that look, I'm of a generation. Like, okay, I remember him or whatever. My generation's going to remember. Scouse John's not going to be remembered.
Well, this is the thing as well. Like a lot of, and it is hard for me to say this, when a lot of people's family histories are lost, not out of malice, but out of sheer bloody ignorance.
Yeah.
Ignorance and indifference. Like, they didn't take that plaque down because they didn't like Scouse John and what he stood for. They took that plaque down because they didn't give a shit.
Because it's like, who the fuck's he? Get rid of this.
Yeah, who the fuck's this guy? Like, they didn't give a shit.
Yeah.
Well, clearly people cared enough to put that plaque up.
Yeah.
And this is what I mean by why headstones matter, why records matter, why the first thing a fascist regime does is start destroying records, because it destroys the history of the nation that it's oppressing.
Yeah.
There's a reason when people were taken from Africa in chains, no one took note of where they were taken from or what their names were, and they were given English-sounding names by white people. Why do you think there's so many Americans, Black Americans with last names like Campbell and Smith and Johnson and Jones? Why is that black names? Those are white people names.
Yeah.
That's what that means.
And the sad thing is, I think sometimes it was almost seen as a bit of a courtesy if the slave owner gave them you can have my surname.
Well, no, this is the thing.
It's just like, and that was supposed to be an honor,
When the ancient Romans freed a slave, the slave had to take on a name. The slave took on their former master's name.
Yeah.
And it was this indication of you became part of their extended family, part of their retinue. So even though you were free, you could never escape the fact that this fucker once owned you.
Yeah, which is why you can identify with people like in history, like Muhammad Ali, who's like,
who said, "No, that's
Cassius Clay was my slave name.
Well,
I renounced that name. My name is Muhammad Ali."
Well, this is why a lot of African Americans will talk about their government name, but they'll have a nickname or a name in AAV that they use culturally that their family call them. And that's how they identify themselves. Like I do it. My real name is Rebecca. That's my government name. I don't use that name anywhere. I don't even get called that at work. But that's the name on all my documents.
Here's the thing, and it's one of the things. I have known Noodle's real name for like several years. I can't call you that. I just can't. I feel weird when anybody calls you that. It's like,
Yeah, like I feel weird hearing my name. I'm more comfortable being called Noodle than I am being called Rebecca.
To be honest, I've known Noodle. What's in it? Noodle and Hissy is the two names I've known Noodle by. Yeah. Okay,
and those are the names I chose for myself. And this is, I think, something that people from oppressed minorities and trans people and LGBT people have in common. We do it all the time. When you move in LGBT circles, a lot of people have a fake name that they go by. a quote unquote fake name. But before long, that name becomes your identity within that circle.
Because I mean, I'm a little bit weird even on like YouTube. Like, I'm very open about what my real name is, and I understand why there are people who are not comfortable with putting it out. Look, okay, I know Noodle's real name. I also happen to know Ring's real name. I'm not going to say it on stream, but I how often Ring? I don't think I've ever called you by your actual name once since I've known you, because I know you as Ring.
It's like, I find it weird calling you your name, Scummer. I just instinctively call you Scummer.
Yeah, and I'm happy with that. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, no, but this is the thing. This is what I'm getting at. When trans people talk about being dead named, there is a comparison to be drawn between that and between the names people gave African American slaves and the names that they then. It's like a lot of the names of freed slaves. They chose their own names and renounced their former master's name because that was a way of reclaiming your own identity. And you know, like you've got a black man who is Abraham Lincoln's Valley, and his name's William Johnson.
Yeah.
Like just let that sink in.
Yeah, exactly.
Just let that sink in. A man who is no more than 2 or 3 generations out of Africa, and his name is Johnson.
Yeah.
What's the betting that his mother's owner or her mother's owner was called Johnson? I put cash money on it.
Yeah.
Because that's how it was done.
Back in 2 secs, guys. Sorry, I'm in a bit of pain right now.
And it's when we talk about, you know, the plantations and everything that are still there, it's so important to. I don't think they should be knocked down. I don't think they should be destroyed. A lot of them have been turned into living history museums, and they matter. And they matter to keep the memory alive because it was a genocide. And to me, keeping a plantation in America open is just as important as keeping a concentration camp in Europe open.
Yeah.
And this is what I mean by it was a genocide. Like it was a cultural, literal genocide. Like more slaves died than people died in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Like, and that's not even slight. That's a massive. Like I think. Let me just double check. Like the total number of deaths directly attributable just to the Middle Passage, so just to that boat trip between Africa and sort of Jamaica or wherever, is 2 million. They reckon on like Wikipedia thinks that between 1500 and 1900 figures suggest up to 4 million. I guarantee you it was more than that. Yeah. All right. And then you've got there's the UN gives figures in the region of 15 million.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that's victims of the slave trade. 15 million people displaced or killed. Because at the end of the, right, if we say 4 million killed on the Middle Passage, how many more died on plantations? How many more died of overwork? How many more were killed by overzealous overseers with, you know, who got too handsy with the whip? How many more died because, you know, they were beaten to death after trying to run away? Yeah. How many were just not recorded when they died because no one cared because they were chattel? They were viewed as animals. And again, when you're looking at empirical evidence says about 4 million on the Middle Passage, doesn't account for all that other stuff.
Yeah.
And this
it also doesn't account for, you know, numbers probably being fudged to look better on shipping manifests.
Mm-hmm. Or how many people arrived and died shortly after.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the descendants of slaves are just as much victims of the genocide as the slaves themselves.
Yeah.
Like, if you don't understand why slavery is directly responsible for the murder of Emmett Till, like, there's a straight line in the history there. Why when Billie Holiday sang about strange fruits, she was also singing about slavery.
Yeah.
When Martin Luther King stood up and said, "I have a dream," he wasn't just talking about segregation, he was talking about slavery as well.
Yeah.
When Obama stood up and said, "Yes, we can change," that's a direct line back to slavery. When Trump stands up and says, "Make America great again," you think he's not harking back to slavery in America? Everything in America is about slavery. Everything.
That being said, I know we're not quite done with the dissecting the plantation scene.
Oh, we're not at all. No.
Yeah, we're nowhere near close done dissecting the plantation scene, but I do have to bring up that Speed says to Lincoln, "We were supposed to make America great, not tear it apart," and that line hits way different.
That line hits different
Post-Trump.
post-Trump. Yeah, we were supposed to make America great, not tear America apart.
Yeah.
And I think that line is very telling because we received it differently in 2012 to how we receive it now.
Yeah.
In 2012, that line, we waved it off. We poo-pooed it as, you just don't have the stomach for this. You can't make an omelette without cracking a few eggs.
Yeah.
And look, and this is, again, it goes back to the montage at the start and end of the film of people remember the battles, not the blood.
Yeah.
Like, we look at the American Civil War, and we all do it. Historians, lay people who watch this movie, we've all sat and looked at the American Civil War, and consciously or unconsciously, we've looked at it and said, we've made a calculation and we've decided, we've been a little bean counter, and we've gone, was it worth it? Was it worth all those deaths, all that fighting, all that war? And at some point, if you're a reasonable human being in the modern day, you've looked at that and you've gone, it was worth it. In the same way you look at the death toll of Russian soldiers in the Second World War and you say, but it brought down Hitler. It was worth it.
Yeah.
When you look at, and there comes a point when you are assessing any war, any battle, any political idea that has had bloodshed to progress it, and you have to decide if it was worth it. One day, I sincerely hope in the not too distant future, we will look back on BLM. We will look back on the murder of George Floyd and of Breonna Taylor and all those names. We will look back in a world where police aren't killing Black people with impunity anymore. We will live in that world. I live in hope that one day we will live in that world. And our children, we will encourage our children in classrooms to look back at the history of the BLM movement and ask, was it worth it? Yeah. And they will look at the world around them in which truly Black people can live in safety in America. And they will say, yes, it was worth it.
Yeah.
Because it got us here.
That's
a really hard pill to swallow when you're living in it and you're not there yet.
And I've often looked back just as a buff on the American Civil War. That I've often looked back on this and trying to think. Yeah, more than 600,000 people are recorded as casualties in the U.S. Civil War. Had it not been, and if it was not for the one thing, slavery ending as a result, I would have said no, it wasn't worth it. But for this greater evil to be gone, from the United States forever, it wouldn't have been worth it had that institution remained Now,
Yeah.
there are issues, obviously. There are issues because of, the way Reconstruction went, and obviously, ultimately ended up with the Jim Crow laws that and I can understand why it feels like a bit of a Pyrrhic victory.
Yes, especially, again, 200 years later, and we're still arguing over whether black people have got the right to walk in the street without someone murdering them.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like much of a victory. But we have sat down as a culture and as a society and said, and we have done the same calculation that Abraham Lincoln had to make. As he's watching those death figures roll in and his wars ramping up, he's got to make a decision. And look, at the end of the day, all war is brinkmanship. That's what war is. At the end of the day, war doesn't necessarily decide who's morally correct or ethical. What war decides is who's got more soldiers to sacrifice.
Yeah, who wins, basically.
It decides who wins. It's who can keep fighting the longest. Like, do we think the Second World War would have ended when it did if the Allies hadn't broken through the blockade and Hitler didn't know they were going to capture him within 2 hours?
Yeah.
No. He would not have put a bullet in his own head if he thought he still had a fight left to fight. If his lines hadn't been utterly destroyed. And all war is two people sat down on opposite sides saying, I can sacrifice more people than you can, and I can keep the bodies piling up longer than you can, and I can still keep my civilian population on side to do it.
And I have to say, yeah, in a way, like, I mean, the American Civil War, in a sense, it's often seen as like the first great war of attrition, like in that respect. I mean, there's a, I mean, I wouldn't say, okay, not necessarily the first, but in modern warfare terms, I mean, there's an awful lot, especially with like Siege of Petersburg. You can see that as a dress rehearsal for World War One. But I mean, like, I think it was like a famous quote by Sherman, like "War is hell." There is more to it than that particular quote. And Sherman was very much like, hey, listen, look, the crueler war is, the quicker it's over. Was kind of his philosophy.
The thing is, I will say this to anyone: if you want to understand war, learn chess.
Yeah.
Because what you learn in chess is that the person who wins is the person with the most pieces left on the board at the end of the game. Chess is a numbers game. It's how many pieces can you keep on the board while taking your enemy's pieces.
Yeah, chess is very much an attrition game.
Yes,
it's very much an attrition game. I'm gonna have to do it. I'm gonna have to quote the Wire Noodle. Sorry, the king stay the king.
Yes.
Yeah.
But don't forget, you can promote your pawns to queen.
Yeah. Well, that's again. I'm going to quote the Wire. Like, it says, if you get one of your pawns to the end of the board, you get to be queen. It says, and like I said, the queen, she ain't no bitch.
Well, this is the thing. Every pawn is a potential queen.
Yeah.
In chess, but pawns are always the first pieces taken and the first pieces sacrificed. Because potential means sweet FA in the heat of war.
I'll show you the clip when we're off air, all right? If I haven't showed you it all before, but I'll show you the clip when we're off air.
Yeah, and it's this thing of, look, all war is two generals sat down saying, I've got more lives that I'm willing to throw at this than you.
Yeah,
and that's what. Why do wars end? Wars end when generals and the public behind them have had enough and are sick of the death.
Yeah. But I also I do have to
peace talks happen because people get sick of the death.
And I do have to say this in terms of the American Civil War, like, because I do have to point this out just because I just need to address some like lost cause shit that might get misinterpreted here.
Look, we're talking about the plantation, so we are getting to that anyway. So
but we're talking. It's like. One of the big lost cause things is that, hey, the South had all the best generals, but the North had the numbers, and just attrition.
Yeah, it's the other way
and
around.
no, look, listen. The Confederates threw lives away needlessly as well. Yes, there's criticism you can make of people like Grant and whatever, but at the same time, I think Grant probably did the best bit in Vicksburg campaign. Probably did the best bit of generalship in the history in that war, without a doubt, and arguably one of the best bit of generalship in the history in the Vicksburg campaign.
Look, as the bleeding heart civilian in the room, I would say that any man who goes to war is throwing away lives needlessly.
Yeah.
Like the only difference between what's changed between the start of a war, when apparently diplomacy is not an option, and the end of a war, when the only option is to sit down and negotiate peace, is how many lives you've thrown away in between.
Yeah.
Can I just wrap up my one bit on generalship before because I'm only just saying this because I know we'll get onto this in the next 2 weeks, like generalship during the Civil War. Can I just say to the South, don't make General Sherman come back down there.
Okay.
Okay. Here's the real question: do you know what CSA stands for?
I have a few options.
Okay. Well, most people think it stands for Confederate States of America. What it actually stands for is couldn't save Atlanta.
Sounds about right.
But anyways,
yeah.
But yeah,
so
back to the plantation scene.
yeah.
Now we've on that rambling trip around American history. It's it's visually stunning, is that scene?
Yeah.
The way it's put together. Like the dancing, it's very Stepford, isn't it? When they're looking through the window. Did anyone else get Stepford vibes?
Well,
yeah.
Like Will's looking around like he's very confused.
Yeah, and I mean, first, Lincoln and Speed are riding through the empty grounds. Where are all the slaves? And we get a shot of some of them hiding in their
house.
In their shacks.
That's a very classic horror movie trope. Like, where is everyone? It sets the suspense immediately of something terrible is about to happen or has happened.
And then we, get a look inside the house and in the in the big main hall.
And we get the veneer of respectability and an upper class dance, and it's all very proper. And there are slaves about carrying trays of champagne, and everyone's dancing, and it's brightly lit, and it's and it's this veneer of respectability that is immediately undercut.
Well, see, and they're even dancing with their masters. Isn't that sweet?
Oh,
yes.
They're dancing with master. Oh, that's sweet.
Yes. I mean, it might be sweet if you're a white person who doesn't know the history, but that's
no. My point is it's
it's that veneer of respectability. It's that veneer of like decency and humanity. And I very much there's a point you told us about the book that I think now is the time to say, because I'm going to say you can very much tell from this scene that the writer of this story absolutely sees through all that rich people nonsense for exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And sees that these people are just parasites on society.
Yeah, because so in the book, there's also a northern society of vampires that call themselves the Union. And they're all wealthy industrialists that, that exploit their workers, basically. And the New York draft riots, which actually did happen in history, are tied to vampire activity in the book.
So the Tories called, they want some tips.
Yeah.
You know, wait, does that mean Margaret Thatcher was a vampire?
She's the fucking uber vampire.
Like, you could see it, couldn't you, within the bounds of this story, that Margaret Thatcher was definitely a vampire.
Yeah.
Well, I
Like,
don't know.
union
I don't think
buster, anti-worker.
the only difference is Margaret Thatcher drained milk, not.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know the reference there, Noodle. Come on.
Yeah, old milk snatcher.
Yeah.
And though, if I remember right in the book, Lincoln does have to, side with the northern vampires, but it's very much a deal with the devil. I don't like it, but I,
Yeah.
necessity
This
kind
is
of
the
move.
thing.
Again,
Lincoln had to do that historically.
Yeah.
Had to deal with northern, like, capitalists.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
The big capitalist names, Bloomberg and Carnegie and all these names. Do you think Lincoln would have got anywhere politically without financial backing?
Well,
Yeah.
again, goes back to what I was saying earlier about the real Lincoln being the pragmatist that he was, and like didn't stand on an anti-slavery platform, stood on an anti-expansion platform, because he was kind of very realistic about what he felt he could do at the time.
Yes, but I think we do have to give credit to.
Yeah.
If you're on an anti-expansion platform, you are not that far away from an abolitionist platform anyway.
No.
To anyone with any basic common sense and forethought.
Yeah, and I think Lincoln was very understood what he could politically get away with, and then that opportunity with the Emancipation Proclamation, and then later the 13th Amendment is like, okay, I have now had the opportunity to go a bit further.
Yeah, it's like with Wilberforce. How did Wilberforce stop slavery in the UK? Not by standing up and arguing against slavery, by changing some random maritime law that crippled the slave trade.
Yeah.
That's exactly like some random maritime law that meant slave trade in the Caribbean became a lot more dangerous, a lot harder, and then after a few years it was no longer profitable. So when they come along and they say let's ban the slave trade, and there's now no argument of profitability against it, and it flies through Parliament. Like that's how they did it. Yeah. Like if you ever watch the film Amazing Grace, there's a great bit where he presents
I love that
law, and his opposition says to the Speaker, "Mr. Speaker, I'd like some time to consider this proposal." Why? It's just some random proposal. But Mr. Speaker, the Jacobites are in.
The bit I love in that is like, give them somebody boring, and they get the most boring person in the house to like pass this motion, so they all like, oh god, let's leave, and then they suddenly realise what's being voted on, and they all try to desperately rush back in before the vote's passed.
Yeah, because you cannot physically vote if you're not physically in the chamber.
Yeah.
And that's a great film. We should do that film at some point.
Yeah.
I love that film. That's a good film.
Yeah, but what I'm getting at is, I think it's unfair to say, and again, I think I said this last week and a couple of weeks ago as well. It's unfair to suggest that Lincoln didn't understand that by standing on an anti-expansion platform, what he was doing was abolition by proxy.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Lincoln, I think, knew what he was doing. He was always like. And even with the whole start of the Civil War and so on, like Lincoln was always like very conscious of. He really put the ball in the South's court, as just to say, I'm not going to start this shit. This shit starts. It's on you. Even if he knew that the Civil War was coming, he was just very much like new. It's like, hey, if you guys are going to start, I'm not going to start this. You and the South started it,
but
so much in the fucking quote unquote war of northern aggression. Come on,
back to the scene, like even the veneer of respectability is quickly torn away, because we get the shot of the, you know, one of the guests pressuring a slave into joining him for a dance, even though she's saying,
Yeah.
oh, I can't dance. Oh, I'll teach you.
Yes, it's very again, it's very Stepford, it's very creepy. And the thing is, you have to understand, right? There was a differentiation between field slaves and household slaves in the American plantation system.
Yes.
You had field slaves who would go out, work the slave, and then you had house slaves who were your domestic servants, your nannies, your hairdressers, all that. But also, you have to understand, and this is not just something that happened in the transatlantic slave trade, in all slave systems throughout history, and therefore I'm not throwing any stones in a glass house. In all slave systems, something that makes slavery, like you're not a slave if this doesn't apply, but well, you are, but it's not. It's not as there is. The slave owners, the slave masters, had full, unfettered access to their slaves' bodies anytime, day or night.
Yeah.
And that means exactly what you think it means.
Yes,
That
and
means that if the slave master at a dance decides he wants a blowjob and he will make a slave do it, and there's fuck all they can do about it.
And let's be honest, there's some very documented cases of them taking advantage of that.
Yes. Like famously, Jefferson had children by slave women.
Yeah.
Like, is it Jefferson? Yeah, Jefferson.
Yeah.
And had affairs with, quote unquote, affairs with slave women. Whether they were consensual or not is very, very murky.
But I also will say, I mean, obviously, I'd hate to cite a Tarantino movie there, Noodle, because I know how much you're not a Tarantino fan.
Has its place. It's not in my watch list, but it definitely has its place.
Django Unchained made this very good whole point about the difference between like house slaves and those who worked out in the fields on the plantations. With the character of Stephen, played by Samuel L. Jackson, who's like, there was this big difference between those that worked in the house and those who worked out in the fields. And like, essentially, like, Samuel L. Jackson's character, you would see, he's kind of like Uncle Ruckus from the Boondocks. If you're familiar with that character, it's like the black guy who says the most racist stuff you can hear say against black people in the entire movie.
Yeah, but anyways,
but yeah, no, very, very much. Don't think just because slaves were in the house, like it was generally accepted that lighter skinned slaves would be put in the house, and it was a place of privilege. But don't think that made it any.
I guess the point being, it was a form of divide and rule.
Yes, very much so.
Because you can make the slaves that worked out there in the fields hate what they would see as the more privileged slaves that worked in the house and had the easier jobs. It was a very good divide and rule system.
I have genuinely had black people say to me, obviously, Rebecca, you don't know what racism is. You've never been the victim of racism, because if we were still slaves, I'd be in the field and you'd be in the house. I've had a black person more than once say things like that to me. That attitude still exists. So yeah, that whole divide and rule, they're very, it is what it is. Now, with this plantation scene, you've got the veneer of respectability, the veneer of riches, the veneer of social propriety and decency.
Yeah.
And what you've got is Will in the middle of it, looking around very... And that plays on two levels. Because immediately the problem is, why are they dancing with slaves? That's weird. It's fucking weird for that scene. Like, the scene's already weird and hyper realistic, but then that's weird, and then you get it descends into the animalism and the viciousness of the fight.
Yeah.
And it show what that scene does. Like, I can absolutely believe that the person who wrote that scene, and I don't know if the scene's in the books, I presume it is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
I can believe the person in that scene is absolutely very anti-capitalist, because what they're doing there, the analogy they're making, because this film is very symbolic, you know, it likes to do that, and the allegory it's making is, look at these people who are dressed up in their finery and their riches, and they're just animals, and they're parasites, and they're evil, and they're vermin. And that's a very, like, you can very much hear the author who wrote that scene saying the words "eat the rich."
Yeah.
Like, that's what that's a point of.
Guys, I think I'm going to dip out the stream because I'm not feeling too good right now. So I think I'll let you guys finish the stream, okay?
Yep.
Okay, well, take care, Scummer.
Thanks for having me in. Right, bye.
Yep.
Yep. So we were. So you're talking about that now. Was that the point you were wanting to make on this, or was there something else you wanted to add?
Well, yeah, that was very much the point. You know, where we have the veneer of respectability that's slowly being torn away in ways that heighten the suspense. And then Adam comes down and says, dinner is served, and then all veneer of respectability is ripped all at once.
All hell breaks loose, yeah. Quite literally. And it is, again, that the whole thing of it being dinner is served, the double meaning of that. Like, let's be clear here. Vampires are and remain and have always been an allegory for the parasitic rich, the parasites on society.
Yeah.
Like, even when you go back to things like Dracula, he's a parasite. He's he's an animal to be put down. He's not a human being.
Yeah.
And obviously our modern sensibilities are very open to viewing. And again, it's this modern sensibilities that says, if you don't agree with me, you're a bigot, you're a parasite, you're a Nazi, you're a fascist, which we've already discussed and I think thoroughly said. There's more nuance to any discussion about politics in that.
Yeah.
But we're very open to being told your political enemies are parasites, are animals.
Yeah.
Do not deserve to be listened to. You don't have to know the arguments against your political enemies because they are animals and they're just brutes and they're not worth your notice. You are above them.
Yeah.
And that's where the danger creeps in. And again, that takes you back to the training montage of this movie. In order to beat the vampires, you have to know their weaknesses. You have to know about them and know their weaknesses. And yet, throughout this film, the clues are there throughout this film that Henry is a vampire.
Yeah.
And yet Abe doesn't notice until it's presented to him.
Yeah.
And it's that thing of you miss what's right in front of you because you haven't paid attention.
Yeah.
But that scene, I also like as well, that scene, like, everyone's dressed in white.
Yeah.
The staircases are white, the walls are white. And it's this, again, to us as a modern audience, that's creepy. We've seen one too many horror movies of little girls who are going to haunt you in a pretty white dress.
Yeah.
Like, creepy. It's very, yeah.
Yeah.
And to us, that plays to our sensibilities. But what you also have to understand is, in the 1800s, white was the colour of purity and good and light and correctness and holiness and piousness, and has been since the Romans were wearing bleach white togas. It's a colour of citizenship. If you wear white, you don't work for a living. If you're
Yeah.
wearing white, you don't do any work that gets you dirty. It's a status symbol. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why in the 1800s, the fashion was to be very pale. Like, it was fashionable. Like, the paler you were, the more fashionable it was, because it meant you didn't go out and you didn't work in the sun, and it meant you were rich.
Yeah.
That's the same way why fashion's in weight cycle. Like, right now, it's fashionable to be skinny because that means that you've got time to go to the gym and you've got money to eat healthily. In a culture where everyone can afford food, but only rich people can afford healthy, nutritious food, it's fashionable to be skinny. In a culture where food is scarce, just in general, food is scarce, not just healthy food, it's fashionable to have more weight on you. Look at how much weight Henry VIII gained.
Yeah.
Look at, the French kings. Madame, what the fuck's her name?
Pompadour.
No, yes, yes, Marie Antoinette.
Yeah.
Who loved chocolate? Who famously loved chocolate, and she was a big girl. She was a big girl. Like, I'm a big girl, but she was a big girl. Like, because when food is scarce, having too much of it is a status symbol.
Yeah.
But then certain cultures talk about moderation. Like the ancient Romans, it was unfashionable to be either too fat or too skinny. But the ancient Romans were a militaristic society where the men were expected to be ready to take up arms at a moment's notice. You can't do that if you weigh 24 stone and you're eating 12 courses every day.
Yeah.
And it's that moderation. So, fashions are very reflective of the culture you're in. Like, at the moment, it's fashionable to have a tan because it means you can travel and see the world and be out in the sun. And you don't spend all your days locked up in an office.
Yeah.
You see how that's different to even 50, 100 years ago when being darker skinned meant you were out in the sun all the time and that wasn't a good thing?
Yeah.
As cultures change, fashions change. And so it's really interesting to view this scene from a modern sensibility. We'd have looked at it and said, candlelight and all that white, and it's creepy and it's weird and there's something Stepford about it and something foreign about it. But that would have been that's exactly what plantations look like on the inside, and that's exactly what their clothes would have looked like.
Yeah.
Like, even the idea of a groom in a white suit is weird to us. Like, it's just odd. But he wore a white suit to his wedding in the film.
I think so. Do we want to talk about the train scene?
I think that there's a bit to be said on the train scene, but honestly, it's just a very fun action movie. Like the Fast and Furious franchise called, they want their end of movie set piece back.
Well, the reason I brought it up is because you had a.
Oh yes, the observation I made as we were watching it.
Yeah.
So look, a fight on top of a train is very Matrix. Like, anyone who's looking at that remembers the Matrix. That's what that's calling back to in that setup. It's what every movie that's ever done it. Every superhero movie does it. Even James Bond movies do it.
Yeah.
Like, it's the Matrix. It's James Bond. It's, oh, look at this badass fighting on top of a moving train.
Yeah.
Well, that's for.
I still think Spider-Man 2 did it the best, but this is probably a close second.
Yeah, like this is up there in the top. I wouldn't say close second, but it's definitely like in the top 5.
Yeah.
And the fact that there is a top 5 tells you how common it is.
Yeah.
And I'm going to read the comment I made as we were watching the scene. I just typed, the imagery of this is very symbolic here. Black and white man fighting together as equals using the same weapon for the soul of a nation.
Yeah.
Because that's what's going on here. They're sharing a weapon. They're using Abe's weapon. Abe's weapon, which I might add, he has modified to incorporate the lesson from his enemy. His enemy carried a cane that had a gun in it, and now his axe has a gun in it.
Yeah, not only a gun,
Well,
but also a bayonet as
yeah,
well.
like he learns from his enemies. He learns just as much from his enemies as from his allies, which is a really important point. And
Yeah.
I think something we should drive home of. You can learn a lot from your friends and your allies, and you absolutely should, in the way Abe Lincoln does in this movie. But pay attention to your enemies too, because sometimes they come up with some clever shit.
Yeah.
Like, don't dismiss them as stupid and unworthy of your attention just because they're your enemies.
Yeah.
You could, like, the quality of a person, you can tell by their enemies. If your enemies are clever, you should be paying attention to that and learning from that. That's how you beat them. You don't beat your enemies by underestimating them. But yeah, this whole thing, they're throwing the weapon backwards and forwards between themselves. It's on the railway, heading towards Gettysburg. It's
they're going, at this point, spoilers for, a movie that's older, that's nearly 2.5 times older than the entire existence of the Confederacy.
Yeah. And has aged much better.
We at this moment we think that the train is carrying silver munitions or silver plated munitions, because the vampire Confederates or the vampires are fighting on the side of the Confederacy, and the army isn't equipped for that.
Yeah. And so you've got them. They use Abe's weapon.
Yeah.
Abe's axe, and they're fighting backwards and forwards, and they're throwing it backwards and forwards between themselves. They're fighting off the enemy. And they're sticking together. When Will falls off the side of the train, Abe grabs him. It's all there, and it's very much in this moment. These two men are two sides of the same coin. And what this movie is telling you very unsubtly, although it doesn't state it explicitly, is you can't have one without the other. Without Will, there is no Abe. Because without the influence of William, of having a black friend, of having someone willing to stand up and be an abolitionist and everything else, there is no Abraham Lincoln, because Abraham Lincoln doesn't have a vested interest in this.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting point that it's making. But it's also, they fight as absolute equals. Like, everything Abe does, Will matches. If Abe hits the guy, Will hits the guy. If Abe goes down, Will goes down. If Abe does like a wicked hot spinning kick, Will does like a backflip and something else awesome.
Yeah.
Like they are working in absolute tandem. They are as close as brothers. They are, they don't even have to speak to each other during this. They are on such the same wavelength. They are absolute equals, fighting together against this man who would enslave one of them and not the other because of the color of his skin. And this thing that's been repeated throughout the movie, this is a fight for the soul of a nation. This is the fight that says that America will be a land of living free men. And it's so important that it's a black man and a white man fighting that battle together. Because what it says is the white man didn't emancipate black people. Black people stood up and played their part in emancipating themselves and were absolutely just as fundamental to that process as the great emancipator Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Like, Lincoln can talk till he's blue in the face about abolition, but if black people ain't standing up and fighting for their freedom, it doesn't happen.
And it also strikes me that it's very important that Abraham Lincoln uses an axe.
Go on.
Throughout this movie. Well, yes, it's
it's a working man's tool. It's not a rich man's tool.
Well, yeah.
And it's a tool he's familiar with from that. And there's also like the...
Well, yeah, my point, it's, a nod to his work as a rail splitter, but more importantly, my point is an axe is a working man's weapon.
Yes. And he is never a rich man. He is never part of the establishment, because the establishment, we are led to believe, are all vampires.
Yeah.
And therefore he's an outsider in the establishment, and it's only an outsider who can destroy the establishment and bring about real change.
Yeah,
And
because
if you're not taking that sentence and applying it to Barack Obama when you see this movie in 2012, you weren't paying attention.
yeah.
Like, because that was the propaganda around Obama, and we fell for it.
Yeah.
And am I saying Obama was a bad president? No, but I'm not saying he was the best either. And his color had naff all to do with either of those statements.
I mean, there is an argument that can be made that the first minority in a high public office has to play a little bit harder. I.e., yeah, there might have been a little bit of Thatcher syndrome going on.
Not with Obama, I don't think. I think with Obama it was the opposite. Obama was very limited by being the first black president.
Yeah.
Because he had to take great care not to be remembered as a Thatcher-like figure who went hell for leather and made it very difficult for anyone to follow in his path by being very hard-nosed about it.
Like, basically, unfortunately, when you're a minority in a position like that, there are cultural expectations that you either have to fulfill or fight against.
Look, let's just put it out there. When a black man gets elected, he represents all black men. When a white man gets elected, he represents himself.
Yeah.
And that's what goes on there. Now, with this this scene, you've got that whole thing with Will and Abe. And it's very important that throughout this film, whenever Abe does something, Will is right there.
Yeah.
And for me, that's very reminiscent of a guy in history called Bayard Rustin, who I'm sure you've heard me talk about before. And Bayard Rustin was the right-hand man to Martin Luther King. But Bayard Rustin could never be a publicly political figure. Because Bayard Rustin, while he was an undergraduate at university, for a short time was a member of the Communist Party of America. Strike one.
Yeah.
Strike one, darling. Bayard Rustin was also arrested for... Let's say he was arrested in a back street in California at night in a car with another man. Strike two. Same reason Marlon Brando could never have been a politician.
Yeah.
Like, there was things around his sexuality there. And Bayard Rustin is the one who taught, like Martin Luther King, when he started out, was not a pacifist. Martin Luther King wanted to keep a gun in his own house for protection. And it was Bayard Rustin who said, no, you must be beyond reproach. You must be a perfect pacifist, and talked him out of keeping a gun in his own house. Like Bayard Rustin, like 90% of the stuff Bayard Rustin said was like that Martin Luther King said came from Bayard Rustin.
Yeah.
And very much, I think what this film is getting at is that, 90% of what Lincoln said was as a result of his friendship with Will.
Yeah.
Sorry, my headphones batteries died.
That's okay.
So yeah, that's what that's getting at, and what that's pointing out is that behind every great man is someone who put him on that path.
Yeah.
Someone who taught him what he saw. Behind John Kennedy, there was Bobby Kennedy. Behind Martin Luther King, there was Bayard Rustin, and behind Abraham Lincoln, there was Will Johnson.
Yeah.
Someone, behind William Wilberforce, there was the abolitionists who came to him. And this is the point. Like, people are not born progressive. You're not born with your politics set.
Yeah.
You learn from the people around you, and the people we remember as the big characters in history who did something and made change are the ones who stopped to listen to those they were fighting for.
Yeah.
And who learned from those people. And this film, I think, is really very good at that, because after the battle at the plantation and after Gettysburg, there's a beautiful blink and you miss it moment. Well, not actually before Gettysburg. There's a beautiful blink and you miss it moment.
Yeah.
Where the kids playing in the Oval Office, and Abe is reading like fucking troop figures and shit.
Yeah.
And Scummer's not here to say it, so I will just say it. Gettysburg wasn't a complete disaster for Lincoln on the first day.
Yeah.
But I can see why they did it for the point of the movie, because they're harking back to what we understand war to be, which is the first day was a disaster. It happened at the Somme. It happened at other major battles in like sort of Western history. So it works as a creative license. I'll give it that. And the son is called out of the room, and Abe calls his son back. And his son kisses him on the cheek.
Yeah.
And he goes toddling off. And Will calls his son.
Yeah.
And kisses him on the cheek. And it's a blink and you miss it moment, but it's very telling that that's normal.
Yeah.
That's accepted in their little family that they've got going on. Because what it says is, I am raising my son to love and honour and obey a black man as he would his own father.
Yeah.
What he's saying is, I am raising my son to understand that there are black men and black human beings who are just as important, who are just as lovable as white people. And that's what that said. That Lincoln didn't just fight the war, that he was thinking ahead and he was training his son in that mentality. Children aren't born racist.
Yeah.
We're not born racist. Like, we're born with a natural aversion to that which we are not familiar. It's why kids are scared of the dark.
Yeah.
You know, we fear the unknown. We fear what we don't know. But if you expose a child to people of different races, different languages, different cultures from a young age, they're not going to grow up racist. Because they're going to look at it and go, but we're all the same underneath. We just speak different languages, or whatever. We pray in different ways. Like, famously, there's that story of a mathematician on a plane, a Muslim mathematician on a plane, writing an equation. And some white person reports him as a terrorist because they think he's writing out in Arabic. And actually what he's doing is like a quadratic equation or some shit.
Yeah.
Like bigotry breeds ignorance is what breeds bigotry, not you can teach people not to be bigots, but they have to be open to learning the lesson. And the point is with Abe's son is that he's teaching him from a young age.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So final thoughts?
Hang on. Sorry. Technical issues,
all right.
folks. Please hold. The dangers of battery-powered headphones, folks.
So, I mean, we do have to do the movie justice by firing off one Chekhov's gun that's been on the mantelpiece the entire time. And once again, spoilers for a movie that's been out longer than out for 2.5 times as long as the Confederacy existed. But there's more than one railroad.
Yes, I did love that. Yeah. Especially as there being that blink and you miss it reference to Harriet Tubman previously as well.
Yeah.
Like, so he'd met her when he was running from the South, and then he sends for her when he needs. Yeah.
Yeah. And the way the movie frames it originally is he's getting Mary out of Washington, in case it gets taken, but no.
Yes, but of course he's going to use Harriet Tubman's entire logistical setup that she's got to get silver secretly to the soldiers.
Yeah.
And brilliantly, very well done, and it's absolutely the kind of like last minute twist that you can absolutely see any action hero pulling.
Yeah.
And I will say for that as well, very great. Love again, and it then anchors Abraham Lincoln, vampire hunter who sent silver to his soldiers on the front line in the history.
Yeah.
So far as I know, the Confederates weren't actual vampires.
Yeah.
But logistics still needed to happen.
Yeah.
And then we get this cut to the modern day. And we get, again, the same bookended history prefers legends to men, nobility to brutality, speeches to deeds, battle but not blood. And then the line from Abe of, what it remembers of me, it shall only remember a fraction of the truth.
Yeah.
And like anyone who knows anything about the geography of the White House and Capitol Hill knows that where Henry stood there, that's the front lawn of the White House. It turns into the modern. But anyone who knows the history, especially of the way that's filmed,
Yeah.
if Henry turns round there, there's a massive statue of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Like that's where it's pitched that he's supposed to be standing. And the helicopter drops down and we see that it's a news story, and then Henry's in the bar. And dude, 300 years and you're using the same pickup line. I mean, you're not wrong, but get a new pickup line. And I get it. It's supposed to feed into the cyclical nature of it and how Henry will forever be in this endless battle. And it's strongly, I think, supposed to hint at, Henry watching over America as its quote unquote guardian angel. It's one good vampire.
Yeah.
And, it's subtly directing politics and politicians in the right direction. And it's, it's an interesting take.
Yeah.
Like, is the guy Henry picks up in that bar, is he going to be president in 20 years? Like, could be.
Yeah.
That's what it's strongly hinting at with the change from the front lawn of the White House to the bar they're sat in, and it being on the news. And again, 2012, any mention of the White House immediately evokes images of the Obamas.
Yeah.
And that's deliberate as well, because what it's basically saying is, look at what Henry has seen happen. Look at the changes Henry has seen. Henry has gone from fighting alongside a black man for the freedom of slaves to seeing a black man in the White House. That's what that's saying.
Yeah.
And it's pointing at the progress that's made. And obviously, like, this is very obviously a pre-2016 movie.
Yeah.
Because it's very hopeful in the way it presents that. It presents that as progress and, the shining house on the hill with a black first family, and look at the progress we've made. But there's still work to be done, but look at how far we've come.
Yeah.
Like, this is obviously a film that was made before Trump was elected.
Yeah.
Because it would be a very different film if it wasn't.
Well, like I said, the "Make America Great" line does hit differently after Trump.
Yeah. And I think it's really important that we do, when we watch films from earlier time periods that we've lived through, that we do stop and sit with how we receive them then to how we receive them now.
Yeah.
Because that tells you a lot about, and this is what I keep hammering home about, films tell you more about the time they're released into than they do about the time they're about when they're historical.
Yeah.
And it's so, so important to hammer that point home. and it tells you the difference. Like, you hear that line now, and it insinuates that the person who said it might be a bit of a racist, might be, a Trump supporter, might have been there on January 6th. But you heard that line in 2012, and you were just like, you just haven't got the stomach for the fight.
Yeah.
And you didn't. But what that line in this movie shows you is those ideas were already there.
Yeah.
And they were already germinating. But we were flying so high. We had Obama in the White House. We were post-racial. We were post-racist. We were flying so high, we thought nothing could bring us down.
Yeah.
And we missed the signs. Because if the signs were there so well that they ended up in a popcorn movie about Abraham Lincoln vampire hunter, the signs were there.
Yeah.
And we made the same mistake that got made when I tell you that anecdote about being in a lecture hall and having to argue for slavery. We made the same mistake over and over again. We assumed that we were right, therefore we were untouchable. And we didn't stop to think that there were other arguments out there that if they were pitched in the right way, that if they were presented in the right way, even if they could be thoroughly debunked, they would undermine what we were fighting for and what we stood for.
Yeah.
And that's one thing if there's one thing I want to talk, this stream, the lesson of this stream for me is never, ever assume that just because you're right, you're going to win.
Yeah.
Always make sure you can back up your argument and your fact. And that's the real lesson of studying history. There are so many times throughout history where people who were in the right, like objectively, morally, ethically, socially, economically, just blatantly correct. And yet their idea didn't take hold. It's like we have 2,500 years of unbroken history in which everyone assumed that Aristotle's view of the world was correct.
Yeah.
And yet there were philosophers who were contemporaries of Aristotle who, the word atom and the idea of an atom is contemporary to Aristotle. And yet we ran for all those centuries with, oh no, the world is made up of these 4 elements and all that nonsense.
Yeah.
We ran with that because no one stopped and went, hang on, I can prove this wrong, and argued against it effectively. It's why it's so important to learn to argue effectively. You can't just say you're wrong, therefore you're wrong. You have to know why.
Or, how long was medicine just, hey, read Galen?
Exactly. Or, how long was cooking just read Apicius? Or, how long did psychiatry get stuck on Freud and hysteria in women? And it's only like Freud found PTSD and CPTSD. Freud found it. And his contemporaries were arguing that that was the cause. And yet it wasn't until 1993 that the idea of women as having a trauma response and not just being hysterical was even given credence in like broadly.
Yeah.
And it would take it wasn't until 2 years ago that complex post-traumatic stress disorder was recognized as a medical condition. So, and that's because Freud didn't have the bollocks to stand up and state his case, and other people didn't have the bollocks to argue with him and didn't argue with him effectively.
Yeah.
Like in very simple terms, that's a very broad statement, but broadly,
and
that's
And for any neo-Confederates who have lasted this long through the stream,
they haven't lasted this long. They've all gone and surrendered by now.
The lesson.
Yeah, these streams lasted nearly as long as the Confederacy.
The lesson that they can pull from this was your system was a parasitic monster that needed to be destroyed.
Yeah, pretty much. And I would go further and say that obviously this film touches on it, but very much the author, if from what I hear of the book, which I haven't read, but I gather that the author's opinion on capitalism is that capitalist and capital and those at the top of the food chain of capitalism are very much of the same vein.
I think I've still got my copy.
Good, keep it. I'll be reading it.
Yeah. And with that, we are going to move to Shilling, where, once again, edited content is going to be spotty for the foreseeable future. But for the rest of the month, we are continuing with our Confederate History Month Monkey Paw. By next week, we are going to talk about the legacy of the Confederacy by discussing the movie Till. And just as a palate cleanser, we will be diving into a bit of the history via the brilliant YouTube series, or an episode of the brilliant YouTube series, Checkmate Lincolnites.
Yes. So, what you're saying is next week's drinking game is every time Bob Dylan gets mentioned, drink.
Yeah.
Every time Billie Holiday gets mentioned, drink. There's lots of discussion to be had there. Obviously, Till is a very triggering subject. So subject matter, it's about lynchings in the American South. So if you are joining us next week, do bear that in mind. Take care of yourself first. Your mental health comes before watching us or listening to us.
There is a reason why it's being sandwiched in between the movie about the vampire hunting president and internet satire.
Yeah. So yes, very much so. It's a difficult one. It is going to be a difficult one, but I think this one I think initially was my recommendation.
For Black History Month.
Yeah, and I think this Till is going to be one of those. It's going to be like when we did God on Trial or when we do certain war films. We're not doing it because it's fun. We're doing it because it's necessary and because there are lessons to be learned. And because it's an important film, or it has an important message. That's not to say all films don't have an important message. I mean, look at how much we've managed to draw out of Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've gone well over twice the runtime.
Exactly. Like there was a lot to discuss there, and I feel like we did a fair job.
Yeah.
But again, it's a hardly high art, is it? But again, this is what I mean. Till it's one of those films. It's a bit like Schindler's List. It's not a film you watch for enjoyment. It's a film you watch because there's a part of you that knows you have a duty to watch it. Yeah. And it tells, and it has an important message. So we will have a lot to talk about, but it will probably be an incredibly deep, incredibly emotional stream next week. Make no apologies for that, but also trigger warning in advance.
Yeah.
Like, we're talking about Till. What did you expect?
Yeah.
And then obviously the palate cleanser afterwards, which should be fun.
Yeah.
And again, for that same reasons, if we had to do a really deep, meaningful movie every week, I think we'd burn out after a month.
Yeah.
But sometimes you've got to do it. So we're going to do it.
And, also, art doesn't have to be deep and traumatic to have meaning.
No, I mean, like I said, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter.
Yeah.
And we've talked about it for over 3.5 hours.
Yeah. And, how many times have we said, wow, this is surprisingly deep for a kids movie.
Yeah, that's basically our tagline at this point.
Yeah.
But yeah, look, you can learn a lot from good media and from deep media, but you can also learn a lot from the junk, the pop fiction, the pulp fiction. And there's just because it's quote unquote bad doesn't mean you can't learn from it. You know, you can learn as much from your enemies as your friends. You can learn what not to do. You can learn by seeing a bad example. And you can learn by sitting down and watching something that is first and foremost a piece of entertainment media. Like, this movie was not designed to be torn apart and analysed within an inch of its life.
Yeah.
But there is enough there to do it.
Yeah.
And that, I think, says more about our prior expectations. We don't expect that movies like this have a lot to say. But they don't necessarily have a lot to say. They give us a lot to think about.
And with that, we'll move to taglines, because after all, mine is, the purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you what to think, but to give you questions to think on. And too often we forget that.
We do. And as always from me, take care, be good. And if you can't be good, remember, use your noodle.